There are moments in history when silence is louder than any sound. Somewhere in that silence, more than 2,000 years ago, the greatest collection of knowledge the world had ever known disappeared. It did not scream as it burned. It whispered, page by page, into oblivion. The Library of Alexandria was not merely a building. It was a heartbeat, the pulse of an age when the boundaries of the known world were being redrawn by curiosity. Scholars crossed oceans to reach it. Kings sent expeditions to capture books as spoils of intellect. Within its halls, the mathematics of the heavens met the poetry of the earth. It was a map of the human mind before the modern world had even begun to imagine one. And then, one night, or perhaps many nights across centuries, it was gone. No one can say for certain what happened. Some claim the flames of Caesar's war reached its scrolls. Others speak of zealots, earthquakes, and floods. Perhaps no single fire destroyed it, but rather a long, slow forgetting, a decay measured not in hours but in generations. The truth has faded into rumour, and the rumour into myth. Yet what was lost still shapes what we know. Every fragment of ancient learning that survived carries the shadow of what did not. The story of the Library of Alexandria is not only about fire and ruin, it is about ambition, the audacity of a civilization that believed all knowledge could be gathered under one roof. It is about human error, arrogance, and hope. And it is about the paradox of survival, how something can vanish completely, yet leave traces everywhere. This book is a journey into that paradox. It follows the library from its creation under the Ptolemies to its decline under empires and faiths. Through centuries of rediscovery and reinvention, it examines what might have been contained in those 40,000 scrolls and how their loss reshaped the history of science, philosophy, and belief. It seeks not only to mourn what was destroyed, but to understand how its absence became one of humanity's most enduring legends. For the myth of Alexandria is not confined to the past. It lives every time a hard drive fails, a language dies, or a culture forgets its stories. It warns that knowledge is not permanent, that progress is not guaranteed, yet it also reminds us that even ashes can speak, that from loss can come renewal, and from silence, understanding. In these pages, the library will rise again. Its marble columns will gleam beneath the Mediterranean sun. Its halls will echo with voices of poets, astronomers, and dreamers. You will walk with them through the corridors of a vanished world, a world that once believed that to know everything was to become eternal. And when the last ember fades, you may find that the library was never truly lost. It was waiting, in the curiosity that drives us still, in the fragile faith that what we learn today will endure tomorrow. The city of Alexandria rose from the dreams of a conqueror who never saw it finished. When Alexander of Macedon ordered its foundation along the Egyptian coast, he imagined a port that would bind the Mediterranean to the lands beyond the Nile. After his death, his general Ptolemy claimed Egypt and made that dream real. Marble quays cut into the blue water. Wide streets met at right angles, paved with stone that glittered in the noon light. Columns stretched toward the open sky, and at the heart of the new city stood a beacon that would later be called one of the wonders of the world. Yet what made Alexandria unlike any other place was not its walls or its lighthouse. It was an idea, the belief that all human knowledge could be gathered in one place and preserved for eternity. The Ptolemaic kings who ruled after Alexander believed that empire was not only measured in territory, but in wisdom. They built the Mouseion, the shrine of the Muses, a place where scholars would live, study, and dine at royal expense. Attached to it was the great library, whose shelves of papyrus scrolls would one day become legend. The early librarians, men such as Zenodotus, Callimachus, and Eratosthenes, were not mere keepers of books. They were explorers of thought, cataloguers of language, and mapmakers of the human mind. They set out to collect every work ever written, from the poetry of Greece to the histories of Persia, from the mathematics of Babylon to the rituals of Egypt. Ships docking in the harbour were searched for scrolls. Every text was copied. The copy was returned, and the original kept in Alexandria. Slowly, the library became the memory of the world. The city thrived on the exchange of ideas. Astronomers climbed the rooftops to chart the motions of stars. Mathematicians traced circles in sand to uncover truths that would later define geometry. Physicians dissected bodies in search of the laws of life itself. Philosophers debated the nature of the soul beneath the shade of marble colonnades. Poets recited verses that drifted with the sea wind through open courtyards. In those years, Alexandria was more than a city. It was a living experiment in human curiosity. The Mausion scholars were given stipends, housing, and food, freeing them to think without the weight of survival. The result was a fusion of cultures, a meeting of Greek logic with Egyptian mysticism, and Persian science with Indian numeracy. Among the treasures that filled the library's rooms were thousands upon thousands of scrolls. Some later accounts claimed that the collection reached as many as 400,000, while others spoke of smaller numbers. One common figure, echoed by ancient writers, spoke of around 40,000 scrolls lost in one catastrophic event. Whatever the precise number, the ambition remained the same. Nothing less than to gather all written knowledge known to humankind. For the Ptolemies, this was not only a service to learning, but a statement of power. Knowledge was empire, and every new scroll added to Alexandria's collection strengthened the prestige of the crown. The librarians developed a vast catalogue, the Pinakas, listing authors, titles, and subjects. It was the first attempt at an organized bibliography. Centuries before printing would exist, to walk among the shelves of papyrus was to travel through time and across worlds. There were plays of Aeschylus and Sophocles, histories of Herodotus, the geometry of Euclid, the astronomy of Aristarchus, who dared to suggest that the Earth moved around the sun, and the mathematics of Archimedes, whose insight could measure the density of the world itself. There were translations of Egyptian, Hebrew, and Persian texts, all written out in Greek so scholars from any land could read them. The library became the axis around which the intellectual life of the ancient world revolved. Merchants, pilgrims, and diplomats who arrived in Alexandria carried not only goods but stories of this wonder. They spoke of endless shelves filled with rolled papyrus, of ink made from soot and honey, of scrolls so delicate that readers breathed softly for fear of destroying them. The air was said to smell of cedar oil, used to protect the papyrus from insects. Within the reading rooms, scholars whispered among themselves, debating numbers and theorems, philosophies and myths. It was here that the first accurate measurement of the Earth's circumference was made, using nothing more than the shadows cast by the sun at different points along the Nile. It was here that maps of the known world were drawn with astonishing precision. Yet the library was more than a storehouse. It was a living organism, constantly growing, feeding on discovery and shaping the way civilizations thought. The scholars who lived within the Mausion saw themselves as part of something divine, an unending pursuit of truth. They believed that to know the cosmos was to know the mind of the gods. In their devotion to collecting, copying, and preserving texts, they were building a bridge across generations. A scroll copied in Alexandria could find its way to Athens, to Antioch, to the far lands of India, carried by students and merchants who sought wisdom. The city's heartbeat pulsed with this quest. At night, the harbour lamps reflected off the calm waters, and from the upper windows of the library the sound of voices drifted, scholars reciting, debating, and dreaming. In the quiet of those halls, it might have seemed that the knowledge of the world was eternal, immune to the chaos of politics or the storms of history. But time would prove otherwise. Beneath the calm surface, empires shifted, armies marched, and fires would soon burn not just the ships in the harbour, but the very memory of what humanity once knew. That night, when flames rose over the Alexandrian docks, they lit more than wood and rope. They illuminated the fragility of human achievement. What had taken generations to gather could vanish in hours. And though the exact details of that first catastrophe would be argued for centuries, one truth remained beyond dispute. A great portion of the world's knowledge disappeared into smoke, leaving behind only fragments, memories, and questions that still haunt us today. Yet in those early years, before the fires and the wars, the Library of Alexandria stood as the brightest mirror of human ambition, the world's greatest archive, born from a dream that knowledge could be infinite, and as the city's scholars gazed at the horizon, they believed they had captured eternity itself. They could not have known that eternity would be the first thing to slip from their grasp. The rhythm of life in Alexandria moved with the tides of the sea. Each dawn, ships entered the great harbour from Rhodes, Cyprus, and the coasts of Asia Minor, their hulls heavy with spices, linen, and sometimes crates of papyrus from the Nile Delta. At the customs docks, royal scribes inspected cargoes, but their eyes lingered not only on trade goods. They looked for scrolls. Every text that entered the city was borrowed, copied by trained scribes, and then returned to its owner. The original was kept within the royal collection. The Ptolemies called it enrichment, visiting merchants called it confiscation. Yet this relentless hunger for words built the vast repository that would become the envy of the ancient world. Within the Mausion, the scholars who tended those scrolls worked under conditions unlike any others. They lived in suites along shaded colonnades, surrounded by gardens filled with fig trees and fountains. Meals were provided at public expense, freeing them from labour. Some compared their life to that of priests, but these priests served no god but reason. Their patron, the king, understood the power that flowed from knowledge. To command scholars was to command the future. The Ptolemies invited mathematicians from Athens, astronomers from Rhodes, physicians from Kos, and poets from Syracuse. Those who accepted found themselves among kindred minds. They discussed numbers as if they were sacred, and stars as if they were messages written across the sky. Eratosthenes, one of the library's most celebrated directors, measured the Earth using only the distance between two cities and the angle of the sun's shadow at noon. Callimachus created the first catalogue of authors, an immense work listing hundreds of thousands of titles. Archimedes wrote letters from distant Syracuse to his friends in the Mausion, describing principles that would later form the foundation of mechanics and hydrostatics. Euclid, who taught geometry there, reduced the chaos of space to a set of clear, elegant axioms that would survive for more than 2 millennia. These were not isolated thinkers, but collaborators who believed the universe could be understood through harmony and order. The library's architecture mirrored its purpose. Visitors entered through a portico supported by columns carved from pale limestone. Inside, high-ceilinged halls opened into smaller chambers, each dedicated to a branch of learning: astronomy, medicine, philosophy, poetry. Scrolls were stored in wooden cases along the walls, labelled with tags that recorded their origin and subject. The air smelled faintly of papyrus and resin. Light filtered through narrow windows, falling across rows of scholars bent over writing tables. Scribes copied texts by hand, using reed pens dipped in ink made from soot, gum, and water. Mistakes were scraped away with pumice and rewritten with careful precision. To hear the soft rustle of scrolls being unrolled was to listen to knowledge breathing. In the courtyards, debates flowed like the Nile in flood. Stoics argued with followers of Aristotle. The poets of the Alexandrian school, men like Theocritus and Callimachus, reshaped Greek literature with their refined verses and mythic allusions. Philosophers discussed the motion of celestial spheres and whether the soul was material or divine. Physicians dissected animals and even, it is said, human corpses obtained from royal prisons, seeking to map the secret architecture of life. Astronomy flourished in the hands of Aristarchus, who dared to suggest that the Earth revolved around the sun, and Hipparchus, who refined measurements of stellar motion that would guide navigators for centuries. Yet Alexandria was not a sanctuary free from ambition. It was a royal city, and knowledge served politics as much as truth. The Ptolemies used the library to strengthen their claim as heirs to both Greek intellect and Egyptian divinity. Each manuscript copied, each new scholar recruited, proclaimed Egypt as the heart of learning. When foreign kings sent gifts, they often included rare texts, treatises on astronomy from Babylon, medical scrolls from India, histories from Carthage. The Mausion became a diplomatic instrument, a way to show that wisdom itself bowed to the pharaoh's house. But this dependence on royal favour made the institution fragile. The death of one patron or the rise of another could shift its fortunes overnight. Beyond the walls of the library, Alexandria grew into a labyrinth of stone and light. Its streets echoed with many tongues: Greek, Egyptian, Hebrew, Persian. The The great lighthouse on the island of Pharos guided ships into the harbour, its flame visible for tens of kilometres across the sea. The Serapeum, another temple complex, combined Greek and Egyptian deities in a fusion of cultures. Market stalls overflowed with ivory, glass, and scrolls copied for private collections. Scholars who could not enter the royal library often gathered in smaller schools, forming circles of study that multiplied across the city. In this way, knowledge radiated outward like sunlight through a prism. For more than 3 centuries, Alexandria remained the meeting point of worlds. Its library held the cumulative memory of civilizations, stretching from the Atlantic to the Indus. Travelers who visited wrote of a city where learning was worshipped and ideas were as valuable as gold. To them, it seemed that such a place could never fall. Yet even in those golden years, the seeds of decline were already sown. Rival powers looked upon the wealth of Egypt with envy. Rome watched the grain fleets that fed its people and saw in Alexandria both a prize and a threat. The scrolls that lined the library's shelves could not defend its walls. History would later remember the moment when war came to the city, when flames lit the harbour and smoke rose over the marble roofs. The scholars who once believed knowledge eternal would learn how easily it could be undone. The library, which had tried to capture all time, would itself become a ghost. But before that night, before the ships burned and the scrolls turned to ash, Alexandria stood in full glory, a testament to what humanity could build when guided by curiosity rather than conquest. For the people who lived there, the library was not myth but daily life. The murmur of voices through shaded halls, the smell of ink and oil lamps, the patient labour of copying words that might outlast empires. In those moments, they believed the work of their hands would endure forever. None of them could imagine that within a few generations, the archive they tended would vanish, leaving behind only echoes carried on the wind. The final years before the first great fire were years of brilliance and tension. Alexandria had become both a jewel and a fault line of empire. The Ptolemies ruled through careful diplomacy, but their dynasty was growing weaker. Rival claimants battled for the throne, and the Roman Republic, expanding relentlessly across the Mediterranean, began to interfere in Egypt's affairs. The scholars of the Mauseion, devoted to truth above politics, worked in the shadow of these power struggles. They continued to copy scrolls, to debate philosophy, to observe the stars, unaware that the fragile peace sustaining them was about to break. The library still thrived. Travelers described its main hall as vast enough to hold thousands of readers. The roof was said to gleam with bronze, and the air was filled with the faint, dry scent of papyrus. The scrolls themselves were organized with meticulous care, each marked with the author's name and a brief description written in red ink. Copies of Homer and Hesiod rested beside medical treatises from the East and translations of Egyptian sacred texts. The city had become a crossroads of languages. Scribes translated Hebrew and Aramaic writings into Greek, preserving ideas that might otherwise have vanished in local wars. For a moment in history, it seemed the library had achieved the impossible. It had gathered the voice of the world into a single chorus. But knowledge, no matter how vast, cannot exist apart from power. When Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in 48 before the Commons era, he found a city divided by civil war. Cleopatra and her brother Ptolemy XIII fought for the throne, and Caesar's intervention ignited a siege that would bring catastrophe. Ancient writers tell of ships burning in the harbour, of warehouses filled with grain and scrolls catching fire as the flames spread inland. Plutarch wrote that the blaze reached parts of the library, consuming scrolls stored near the docks. Seneca, quoting earlier historians, claimed that around 40,000 scrolls were destroyed in that single night. To the soldiers, it was a tactical necessity. To the scholars, it was the end of the world. Imagine the scene as the firelight reached the library's outer buildings. Scrolls, dry and brittle from years of storage, ignited like autumn leaves. The air filled with the crackling of papyrus and the scent of resin as wax seals melted. Smoke curled through the colonnades, and the glow of the flames painted the marble walls in shades of gold and red. Those who tried to save the scrolls could only grab a handful before heat drove them back. The night sky above the harbour pulsed with orange light, and the sound of collapsing timbers mingled with the shouts of men and the cries of gulls. When morning came, parts of the city lay in ruins. The ships that had once carried goods and books across the world were blackened skeletons on the shore. Not all was lost, though. The main building of the Mausion may have survived, at least in part. Some scholars argue that the greatest portion of the library's collection remained intact, stored deeper within the royal quarter. Others believe that backup collections existed, smaller archives kept in temples and academies around the city. These may have preserved thousands of works that later found their way to other centers of learning. Even so, the loss of any part of the library was a wound to civilization. Each destroyed scroll represented not just one man's labor, but the memory of entire cultures. After the fire, Alexandria rebuilt. The scholars returned to their studies, perhaps shaken but not defeated. New scrolls were copied, new knowledge added. The Mausion continued under Roman patronage, though never again with the same royal independence. Yet something had changed. The dream of completeness, of gathering every work under one roof, had been broken. From then on, the library's story became one of resilience against decay. The collection that survived would face neglect, religious zeal, and further flames across the centuries. In the silence that followed the first disaster, those who walked among the blackened halls must have felt the fragility of human achievement more deeply than ever. The fire that had burned in the harbour had not only consumed papyrus, it had shown that wisdom itself could perish. For the first time, humanity glimpsed the cost of forgetting. The library had been built to hold all that was known, but even knowledge could not defend itself against accident, ambition, or war. And yet, even as the ashes cooled, the idea of the library endured. The scholars who remained began again, restoring what they could, sending for copies from other cities, teaching new generations who would carry fragments of that lost wisdom into future ages. The fire had destroyed part of the collection, but it had not erased the hunger to understand the world. That hunger, reborn from ruin, would carry Alexandria into the next centuries, when new temples, new libraries, and new guardians of knowledge would rise from the shadows of the first catastrophe. The night that lit the docks of Alexandria marked the beginning of a long decline, not an end. Yet for those who witnessed it, it must have felt as if the stars themselves were being extinguished. The glow that once guided ships into the harbour was reflected now in the flames of destruction. From that moment on, every scholar who spoke of the library would do so with a trace of mourning. What had once been the heart of the world's learning had proven mortal, and though it would continue to live for generations, a part of its soul had already burned away. The fire that swept through Alexandria in 48 before the Common Era began not with malice but with strategy. Julius Caesar, trapped in the royal quarter during the siege, ordered the ships in the harbour set ablaze to block the enemy fleet. The flames, once kindled, were carried by wind across the wharves and warehouses. The city's docks, filled with wood, pitch and oil, became a furnace that burned for days. From the decks of his flagship, Caesar could see the reflection of the blaze on the water, and behind it, the silhouettes of marble buildings flickering in the light. What he could not see was how far the fire would reach, nor what irreplaceable treasures it would consume. Ancient witnesses offer conflicting stories. Plutarch wrote that the fire spread from the harbour to parts of the great library, destroying scrolls stored in nearby depots. Seneca, writing a century later, cited earlier historians who claimed 40,000 volumes were lost in that fire. Strabo, who lived in Alexandria soon afterward, made no direct mention of the disaster, which suggests the damage may not have reached the main collection. Yet others, like Cassius Dio, spoke of the library's outer buildings being caught in the blaze. Each account carries the distortion of time, but together they paint the outline of a tragedy that echoed across centuries. Imagine the harbour that night. The masts of burning ships fell into the water with a hiss. Sparks drifted inland, carried by the wind toward the royal district. The warehouses near the docks, which held grain, supplies, and scrolls awaiting cataloguing, caught fire one after another. Flames climbed the wooden scaffolding and leapt across narrow streets. Citizens fled through the smoke, carrying what possessions they could. Scholars and scribes ran toward the library, desperate to save what was stored there. Some accounts say they formed lines, passing scrolls hand to hand, but the fire moved faster than human effort. Papyrus, once the medium of immortality, turned to ash in moments. The library itself stood near the palace, surrounded by high walls and courtyards. Whether the fire reached its core remains debated, but even partial destruction would have been devastating. Many scrolls were stored temporarily in warehouses by the docks before being catalogued. Others were held in annexes used for duplication and translation. It was these collections that most historians believe perished first. The figure of 40,000 scrolls may refer to these holdings alone, yet the symbolism of the loss grew larger with every retelling. The burning of books, even if partial, became the burning of civilization itself. For the scholars who survived the days after the fire must have felt like wandering through a tomb. Charred fragments of papyrus drifted through the air like black snow. Rooms once filled with the soft sound of reading now echoed with silence. The librarians began the grim work of counting what remained. The main catalogue, the Pinakas, may have survived, though likely damaged. Some surviving lists mention works of Aristotle, Euclid and Archimedes still available decades later, evidence that not all was lost. Yet for every text preserved, there were others erased from existence, their titles remembered only in passing references, their contents forever unknown. The Roman soldiers who had fought in the streets left behind a city scarred but alive. Caesar himself stayed in Alexandria long enough to help restore order. He wrote in his own accounts of the campaign but said nothing of the library, perhaps because he saw it as collateral damage in a larger war. To him, the burned scrolls were unfortunate but insignificant beside the triumph of victory. To the scholars, they were the light of human reason snuffed out. The contrast between military conquest and intellectual loss would define the memory of the event for centuries to come. In the aftermath, the surviving librarians and philosophers began to rebuild. Egypt, now under Roman influence, remained wealthy, and royal patronage continued, though the political landscape had shifted. Cleopatra, Caesar's ally and later his lover, recognized the library's symbolic power. Under her reign, efforts were made to replenish the lost works. Ships arriving at the harbor were once again searched for scrolls. Copies were made of every text that could be found. New scholars were invited from Greece and Syria. The fire had wounded Alexandria, but it had not destroyed its spirit. For a time, the city seemed determined to prove that knowledge could rise again from ash. Even so, the memory of the flames lingered. Every new generation of scholars worked under the shadow of that loss. They knew that no matter how many scrolls they copied, the originals of countless others were gone. Works by poets whose names were now meaningless, treatises on astronomy written in vanished dialects, commentaries on philosophy lost to time, all had been consumed in a single night of chaos. The library, which had once promised eternity, was now mortal. Its custodians became its mourners. Centuries later, Roman historians would look back on that night as the moment when the light of Greek learning began to fade. It was not true. Alexandria would continue to shine for hundreds of years, but the image of the burning library became too powerful to resist. It symbolized the fragility of civilization, the ease with which a spark could erase centuries of thought. The fire of 48 before the Common Era was both a real event and a mythic warning. It reminded the world that knowledge, like empire, could fall to fire and forgetfulness alike. In the decades that followed, the Museum still functioned, though diminished. Scholars continued to study, to copy, to teach. The Serapeum, another great temple complex nearby, housed what would later be called the Daughter Library. Yet the Golden Age was over. Rome's rise had shifted, the center of power. The scholars who once shaped kings now served them. The library's dream of gathering all the world's wisdom under one roof survived in memory, but never again in fact. The days following the fire were filled with confusion and smoke. The wind carried the bitter scent of charred papyrus across the harbor, a smell that would linger for months. Sailors swept the ashes from their decks, merchants repaired what remained of their storehouses, and scholars wandered through the ruined quarters in silence. To the citizens of Alexandria, It was one more disaster in a city that had seen many, but to those who worked in the Maussion, it was an unthinkable wound. They had believed the library eternal, as permanent as the sun that rose each morning over the sea. Now they understood that even the most perfect order of knowledge could be undone by chaos in a single night. No one recorded precisely which scrolls were lost, but fragments of testimony hint at the scale of destruction. Seneca, quoting earlier historians, spoke of 40,000 scrolls destroyed. Plutarch mentioned that the fire reached the buildings near the docks where part of the collection was kept. Others wrote that the blaze spared the main library, but consumed warehouses full of copies awaiting cataloguing. Later, writers added details that blurred fact and legend, transforming a limited tragedy into a mythic annihilation. What began as an accident of war grew in memory until it became the story of civilization itself set aflame. Some modern historians believe that the number of 40,000 may refer not to the entire collection, but to the portion stored near the harbour. The main building of the Maussion, farther inland within the royal district, may have survived mostly intact. Strabo, who lived in Alexandria only a few decades later, described the Maussion as a functioning institution, complete with lecture halls, gardens, and living quarters for scholars. His account suggests that the core of the library continued to exist, though perhaps diminished. This would explain how Alexandria remained a centre of learning long after Caesar's siege. Still, the loss was immense. Even if only a fraction of the library burned, the damage struck at the heart of its mission. Every scroll destroyed represented countless hours of labour, the work of scribes, translators, and thinkers who had sought to preserve wisdom from every corner of the known world. Many of those texts existed nowhere else. Once reduced to ash, they vanished not only from shelves but from memory. The people who had written them were long dead, their civilizations fallen. Without their words, entire branches of thought were silenced forever. Among the ruins, the surviving librarians began their long task of recovery. They sent letters to scholars across the Mediterranean, requesting copies of lost works. Some responded generously, others not at all. The task of rebuilding was slow, but Alexandria remained. Rich and Cleopatra's rule gave the scholars hope. She understood that the library was more than a storehouse of books. It was a symbol of royal prestige. Under her patronage, scribes were employed once again to copy Greek tragedies, Babylonian astronomical tables, and Egyptian hymns. The collection began to grow, though it would never again match its former scope. In this period of rebuilding, the Maussion changed character. It was no longer the serene world of philosophers supported by a generous king, but a Roman-controlled institution, dependent on foreign approval. Scholars worked cautiously, aware that their patrons now valued loyalty as much as intellect. Some adapted, turning their studies toward practical subjects favoured by Rome: engineering, navigation, and medicine. Others withdrew into private teaching or correspondence, spreading fragments of Alexandrian learning to distant lands. In this way, even destruction could not fully silence the city's influence. Debate over what exactly burned continued even in antiquity. Some argued that the fire consumed only copies and duplicates, leaving the main library unharmed. Others insisted that the flames reached deep into the royal quarter, devouring the oldest scrolls. The truth may lie somewhere between. The Great Library was not one building but a network: archives in the palace, storerooms by the harbour, and secondary collections in temples. When one part burned, the others endured. Over the following centuries, however, each would meet its own fate. The tragedy of the library was not one event, but a chain of losses stretched across time, each fire feeding the myth of the one that had come before. From Rome, the news of Alexandria's burning spread quickly. Philosophers and poets lamented the destruction. Cicero mentioned the city's turmoil with sorrow, calling it a calamity for learning. Yet others viewed it as inevitable, even just. To the Roman mind, Alexandria's wealth and arrogance had long provoked envy. The library, with its ambition to collect all human knowledge, seemed to some a challenge to Roman authority. If fire humbled it, perhaps that was seen as divine balance. Such sentiments reveal how fragile the pursuit of knowledge can be when set against the pride of empire. When Caesar departed Egypt, leaving Cleopatra as queen, he left behind a city scarred but alive. The docks were rebuilt, the lighthouse continued to shine, and the library's remaining halls once again filled with scholars. But something essential had changed. The aura of immortality that once surrounded the Museum had been broken. Those who studied within its walls knew now that their work was mortal. They copied faster, stored duplicates in safer places, and taught more students than before, as if to ensure that knowledge might survive even if buildings did not. The fire had taught them that the mind must be scattered to endure. For the citizens who had watched the sky glow red that night, the memory would last for generations. Parents told their children of the fire that devoured books and filled the air with burning words. Sailors approaching the coast years later still pointed to the royal district and whispered that ghosts of scrolls drifted over the sea when the wind was right. Thus, legend began to replace fact. The true extent of the loss was forgotten, but the feeling of it remained, the sense that something vast and irreplaceable had vanished forever. The years that followed the fire were years of cautious recovery. Alexandria, though wounded, remained a living city. Its harbour was cleared, the charred ships replaced by new vessels, and trade resumed. The royal quarter, where marble once cracked under heat, was rebuilt under Cleopatra's rule with the same grandeur that had defined her ancestors. Within its walls, the surviving halls of the Museum reopened. Scribes returned to their desks, copying what remained. Teachers lectured in the gardens again, and young students came from distant lands to study under the city's surviving masters. To the outside world, it seemed as though the library had survived the disaster intact. But those who worked within its walls knew better. They could feel the emptiness between shelves where scrolls once stood, the silence in corners where voices used to echo. Cleopatra understood the symbolic power of restoring the library. She saw in it not only a shrine to learning, but also a monument to her dynasty's endurance. Rome might dominate the Mediterranean, but Alexandria would remain the beacon of intellect. She ordered the acquisition of new scrolls from Athens, Pergamon, and even the far reaches of Asia Minor. Scholars were sent to collect works that had escaped the fire. In some accounts, she received generous donations from allies seeking her favor. The rebuilding became an act of diplomacy, a way to display Egypt's resilience in the face of Roman interference. Yet despite her efforts, the original completeness of the library could never be regained. Some texts had existed only in a single copy. Once burned, they were lost forever. Still, life inside the Museum persisted. Students studied Euclid's geometry, physicians practiced the teachings of Hippocrates, and poets continued to compose verses under the shadow of the colonnades. The institution adapted to new realities. Without the full patronage of the Ptolemies, scholars sought independent means of support. Wealthy families began to sponsor small collections of their own, creating miniature libraries scattered across the city. In this decentralization lay both protection and loss. Knowledge was no longer concentrated in a single place, but spread thin, harder to destroy yet harder to preserve. The ideal of one universal archive was fading into memory. Under Roman rule, the character of Alexandria changed. The city remained cosmopolitan, but now its scholars answered to new masters. The Romans valued practical knowledge, engineering, navigation, medicine, more than philosophical speculation. They admired the library but did not revere it. To them, it was one of many treasures within their empire, not the heart of human civilization. Yet, even Roman pragmatism could not extinguish the old Alexandrian spirit. The scholars continued their work quietly, maintaining their rituals, their debates, and their faith in learning as a sacred pursuit. In time, the legend of the first fire grew beyond proportion. Later generations would imagine the entire library consumed in one night, all 400,000 scrolls reduced to ash. The truth was subtler. What perished was perhaps one portion of the collection, but its symbolic weight was immense. The burning of those scrolls marked the first visible crack in the great edifice of accumulated wisdom. People remembered not the numbers but the feeling that something vast had vanished, and that human achievement, no matter how noble, could be destroyed by a single act of war. That memory endured far longer than the smoke that rose over the harbour. As decades turned into centuries, Alexandria rebuilt again and again. Earthquakes damaged the harbour, revolts shook the city, and dynasties rose and fell. Through it all, the scholars held fast to their mission. The Mausion continued to operate, though its scope narrowed. Over time, attention shifted to another institution, the Serapeum, a grand temple dedicated to the god Serapis, where many believe a second, smaller library was established. Some historians call it the daughter library, perhaps founded to house copies and duplicates that survived the earlier fire. Others think it existed from the beginning, a companion to the royal collection. In either case, it became the new heart of Alexandria's intellectual life. The Serapeum stood on a hill overlooking the city, a monumental complex of columns and courtyards. Within its walls, priests and philosophers worked side by side. The temple's library was smaller, perhaps holding only tens of thousands of scrolls, but it carried the legacy of the great library. Here, knowledge was preserved through ritual as much as through scholarship. The god Serapis, a fusion of Greek and Egyptian deities, symbolized unity between worlds, just as the library had once united the learning of many cultures. The scholars who worked there saw themselves as heirs to a sacred trust. The guardians of what remained after fire had tested the faith of humankind. Centuries later, the Serapeum itself would fall to violence, destroyed in another wave of zeal and conquest. But that story belongs to a later chapter. For now, in the years after Caesar's siege, Alexandria endured. Its streets still echoed with many languages, its harbour still glittered beneath the Mediterranean sun, and in quiet rooms by lamplight, scribes still copied words written thousands of years before. The world had changed, yet the idea of the library, the dream that knowledge could be gathered, shared, and made eternal, refused to die. The first fire had taught humanity its most painful lesson. What can be written can also be lost. What can be learned can also be forgotten. But it also taught that memory, once kindled, can survive even the fiercest flames. In the ashes of the great library's earliest destruction, the seeds of its legend were sown. Those seeds would grow through centuries of retelling, until the library that once stood in marble and cedar became something greater than its walls, a myth, a warning, and a symbol of everything that knowledge could be and everything it could lose. Centuries slipped by like sand through glass. The first flames that had blackened the docks of Alexandria faded into memory, and the library, rebuilt and replenished, lived on beneath the changing skies of empire. The Roman eagle flew over Egypt now, and with it came order, wealth, and the steady erosion of independence. The Mausion endured, but no longer as the radiant heart of the world's knowledge. It had become an echo of its former self, still respected, still alive, yet slowly fading into the background hum of empire. Scholars continued to teach, to measure the stars, to write their treatises, but the grand dream of collecting all human wisdom in one place had begun to wane. The world around Alexandria was changing. The Rome of Augustus and his successors had little patience for the boundless curiosity that once defined the Ptolemies. The emperors demanded stability, not discovery. Knowledge was now a tool of governance and engineering. The mathematicians and physicians of Alexandria were valued not for their vision, but for their usefulness. They designed machines, improved irrigation, and advised on medicine and navigation. Philosophy still found a place, but it was no longer the free-ranging speculation of earlier centuries. The scholars who once debated the nature of the cosmos now tread carefully, aware that even ideas could offend those in power. The Mausion, though diminished, still stood. Within its marble halls, the descendants of earlier librarians preserved what they could. They copied manuscripts for Roman patrons, taught arithmetic and geometry to administrators, and tended the ancient catalogue of scrolls. Yet as new generations passed, the institution lost the vitality that had made it unique. Without royal devotion, the library became bureaucratic. its caretakers more concerned with maintaining order than with expanding knowledge. The energy that had once driven explorers like Eratosthenes and Aristarchus had scattered to other lands. Pergamon, Athens, and later Constantinople began to rise as centers of thought. Alexandria remained respected, but it was no longer unrivaled. Still, traces of its old spirit endured. Physicians studied the human body in ways forbidden elsewhere, drawing from traditions that stretched back to the days of Herophilus and Erasistratus. Mathematicians refined the geometry of Euclid, and astronomers continued to track the slow dance of the planets across the night sky. But even these efforts were tinged with nostalgia. Scholars quoted older masters more than they created new work. They revered the past because they felt the present slipping from their hands. Each generation knew that something vast had once flourished there, something they were only dimly preserving. By the 2nd century after the Common Era, the library's identity had changed entirely. It was no longer one institution, but many fragments scattered across the city. The royal collection within the palace survived in part, but smaller archives in temples and schools took on new importance. Among them, the Serapeum rose to prominence. Perched on a hill overlooking the city, this grand temple dedicated to the god Serapis became both a religious sanctuary and a center of study. Inside its colonnades, scrolls were stored, copied, and read by priests and philosophers alike. The Serapeum's library may have begun as a supplement to the original collection, a safe repository for duplicates and translations. But over time, it became the de facto heir of the Great Library. The Serapeum represented the fusion of worlds that defined Alexandria itself. The god Serapis combined the visage of Zeus with the attributes of Osiris and Apis, uniting Greek and Egyptian traditions. In the same way, the temple's library united the old learning of Greece with the mysticism of the East. Within its halls, mathematics coexisted with theology, and astronomy mingled with astrology. Knowledge had become inseparable from faith, and priests of Serapis spoke of the stars not only as celestial bodies, but as divine messengers. This blending of science and religion would later draw both admiration and scorn, but in its time, it gave Alexandria a new kind of vitality. The Roman emperors who ruled Egypt from afar alternately tolerated and neglected the city's scholars. Some, like Hadrian, admired Greek learning and encouraged the preservation of culture. Others cared little for intellectual pursuits, focusing instead on trade and taxation. When political unrest shook the empire, Alexandria often suffered. Riots erupted between Greeks, Jews, and Egyptians, each group defending its place in the city's layered identity. The libraries, caught in the crossfire of such conflicts, faced neglect and occasional damage. Scrolls decayed from humidity, insects, and the slow crumble of papyrus. Without constant copying, even surviving texts began to vanish through time itself. For the scholars who lived through this slow decline, the tragedy was not a sudden fire, but a creeping silence. They watched as rooms once filled with voices grew quiet, as the royal stipends dwindled, as fewer students arrived from abroad. The library's great catalogues fell into disuse. Some were lost, others left incomplete. The once organized system of knowledge became a labyrinth of fragments. Scholars had to rely on memory, tradition, and what few scrolls they could preserve. The dream of universal collection, of capturing all that humanity knew, was slipping into myth. And yet, even in decay, Alexandria remained luminous. Travelers who visited the city still spoke of its scholars, its observatories, and its deep wells of learning. They described priests at the Serapeum who could recite long passages from Homer, astronomers who measured eclipses, and physicians who performed operations with skill unmatched elsewhere. The glory of the past may have dimmed, but its embers still glowed. The city had become a bridge between worlds, Greek, Egyptian, and Roman, holding fragments of all and belonging fully to none. The slow fade of Alexandria's libraries was not marked by flames, but by dust. Scrolls cracked with age, ink faded, and knowledge quietly dissolved into forgetfulness. This was a loss less dramatic than fire, but equally final. There are few ruins more haunting than those that vanish without destruction, those that simply cease to matter. The library's decline was not the story of one night of tragedy, but of centuries of indifference. And as empires shifted and religions rose, indifference would prove more deadly than any soldier's torch. The centuries turned like pages slowly yellowing with age. Rome grew old, its power spread thin, and new forces began to rise in the east. In Alexandria, the library that had once been the pride of kings and the envy of nations still existed, though in a changed form. The scholars of this later age no longer dreamed of collecting every work of humanity. They struggled simply to preserve what remained. Scrolls had become rare and costly. The art of papyrus making declined, and with it the quality of the materials on which knowledge depended. Each copy was more precious than gold, yet each was more fragile than ever. The Serapeum had by now become the soul of Alexandria's intellectual life, its wide courtyards filled with priests, philosophers, and mathematicians, each drawn to the promise that within those stone walls lay the last echo of the great library. Columns of granite rose toward the blue Egyptian sky, and in the inner sanctuaries the god Serapis looked out with the calm face of eternity. To many, the temple was more than a place of worship. It was the living symbol of harmony between reason and belief. But that harmony would not last. The world beyond its gates was shifting toward new gods, new empires, and new certainties. By the 4th century after the Common Era, Christianity had taken root across the Roman world. The emperors themselves had converted, and temples that had stood for 1,000 years began to fall silent. In Alexandria, this change came violently. The city, always a meeting point of worlds, became a battlefield of faiths. Christians, Jews, and followers of the old gods clashed in the streets. Statues were defaced, idols toppled, and sacred precincts desecrated. The Serapeum, long a beacon of classical learning, became one of the last strongholds of pagan philosophy. To the Christian authorities, it represented not enlightenment, but heresy, the memory of a world that denied the new truth. Accounts of what followed differ, yet the outcome was the same. In the year 391, under orders from Emperor Theodosius, pagan worship was outlawed throughout the empire. In Alexandria, Bishop Theophilus led a campaign to destroy the remaining temples. Crowds of Christians marched through the streets carrying crosses and banners, chanting hymns as they approached the hill of the Serapeum. The defenders inside, priests, scholars, and a few desperate citizens, barred the gates. For days they held out, but their resistance was hopeless. The temple was stormed, its statues smashed, its altars overturned. The colossal image of Serapis was torn down and broken into pieces. Whether the library within the Serapeum was also destroyed that day is uncertain, but it is likely. Ancient writers mention books and scrolls burned or scattered, others taken by private collectors or looted as trophies. If any remnants of the great library still survived, they may have perished then, not in one great fire, but in a storm of zeal. The flames that had once been accidental under Caesar now burned with purpose, a fire lit in the name of faith, not war. The loss was not merely of objects, but of spirit. The old belief that knowledge could stand above politics and religion was gone. The age of inquiry that began with the Ptolemies had reached its end. Yet even amid destruction, fragments endured. Some scholars fled Alexandria, carrying with them scrolls and manuscripts. They sought refuge in Constantinople, in Antioch, and in the distant academies of the East. From these scattered seeds, parts of the Alexandrian tradition survived. Commentaries on mathematics and astronomy written by these exiles would later influence thinkers of the Islamic Golden Age. The library may have died, but its lineage continued in exile. Not in marble halls, but in the minds of those who refused to forget. The city itself changed. Christian churches rose where temples had stood. The great column of Pompeii still marked the hill where the Serapeum once dominated the skyline, but around it the voices of philosophers gave way to the chants of monks. The old learning, though suppressed, lingered in quiet corners, in private homes and scriptoriums where monks copied what they dared to preserve, sometimes disguising pagan works within Christian texts. In these hidden acts of preservation lay the faint heartbeat of a civilization refusing to die completely. To walk through Alexandria in those years was to feel the weight of time pressing down. The sea still glittered, the lighthouse still shone, and the harbour still bustled with ships, but the city's mind had changed. The air that once hummed with debate was filled now with sermons. The scholars who had measured the earth and the stars were gone, replaced by priests who spoke of heaven and salvation. The slow fade of the library had become the slow transformation of Alexandria itself, from a city of seekers to a city of believers. Yet there was tragedy in that transformation, for the two were not enemies by nature. The faith that rose from the desert and the knowledge born beside the sea might have lived together, had the age been kinder. But the centuries between them were filled with fear. Fear of heresy, fear of loss, fear that truth might threaten order. So fire returned to Alexandria, not as an accident of battle, but as the chosen instrument of purification. And when the smoke cleared, the world was different. The last fragments of the great library, the last echoes of the old gods, the last teachers of the ancient sciences were gone or scattered. The destruction of the Serapeum marked the end of an era, but not the end of curiosity. Even among the victors, there were those who mourned what had been lost. Some Christian scholars later wrote with reverence of the philosophers who had come before them. They saw in the fallen library a warning that ignorance born of zeal could consume even the brightest flame. And so, though the temples were gone, the story of their fall endured, passed from mouth to mouth, from chronicle to chronicle, until the ruins themselves became sacred in memory. The story of the library's fall did not end with the Serapeum. Even after the temple's destruction, Alexandria remained a city of contradictions, holy and profane, fading and eternal. The air still carried traces of its old brilliance, though dimmed by centuries of turmoil. Philosophers continued to teach in small gatherings, preserving what scraps of learning they could. They copied texts in secret, wrote commentaries on fragments of Aristotle, and whispered the names of thinkers whose works had perished. In dark rooms lit by oil lamps, the last heirs of the Hellenistic world tried to keep alive the fragile flame of reason. By the 7th century after the Common Era, a new power was rising from the deserts beyond Egypt, the armies of Islam. They swept across the Middle East with astonishing speed, uniting tribes and cities under a single faith. In the year 641, Alexandria fell to the forces of Caliph Umar. The event marked the final transformation of the ancient world, yet even here, the truth is tangled in legend. For centuries, a story has circulated that the Caliph ordered the remaining scrolls of the library burned, declaring that if the writings agreed with the Quran, they were unnecessary, and if they disagreed, they were dangerous. Monks and later chroniclers repeated this tale, and it passed into the fabric of Western imagination. But most historians now doubt it ever happened. The story appeared centuries after the conquest, written by authors hostile to Islam, and no contemporary records mention such an order. By the time Umar's armies entered Alexandria, the library as it had once existed was already gone. The Serapeum had been destroyed 250 years earlier, its collections scattered. The Royal Mansion had vanished long before that, its halls repurposed or forgotten. If scrolls still remained in the city, they were likely private copies stored in monasteries or homes. The idea of a single, vast library still waiting to be burned is a ghost born of nostalgia, a final chapter written by those who could not accept that the world's greatest archive had already faded away, long before the Arab conquest. What may have survived into those later centuries were fragments, copies of copies, carried from one scribe to another. Some Greek manuscripts did pass into the hands of Muslim scholars, translated into Arabic by thinkers in Damascus and Baghdad. Far from destroying knowledge, the early Islamic world preserved it. In the centuries that followed, mathematicians, physicians, and philosophers, working under Abbasid caliphs, studied the works of Aristotle, Euclid, and Galen. Much of this knowledge came in directly from Alexandria, transmitted through Syriac translations and Byzantine intermediaries. In this way, the intellectual spirit that had once filled the library did not die with it. It simply changed language and form. Still, the legend of the caliph's decree endured because it spoke to something deeper. The fear that wisdom could be erased by faith, that words could vanish under the weight of belief. It reflected the sorrow of those who looked back at the ruins of antiquity and saw not transformation, but loss. The myth persisted, because it carried truth of another kind, that ignorance, whether born of zeal or neglect, can be as destructive as fire. It is easier to imagine one night of burning than to face the slower, more painful reality that centuries of forgetting had already done what no conqueror's torch could. By the time the Arab scholars rebuilt Alexandria as part of their empire, the old library was a memory folded into the city's stones. New schools and mosques rose, and with them new traditions of learning. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad would one day take up the role that Alexandria had once played, gathering texts from every known culture and translating them into Arabic. Through those translations, the lost library found new life. When Europe emerged from its own centuries of darkness, it was through the works preserved and expanded by the scholars of the Islamic world that much of Greek science and philosophy returned. Thus, in an irony of history, the empire once accused of burning the library became one of its truest heirs. The slow fade of Alexandria was therefore not an ending, but a transformation. The papyrus scrolls turned to dust, but their ideas survived in ink and parchment elsewhere. The halls of the Mausoleum were forgotten, yet their echo lived in monasteries, mosques, and later universities. What the library had tried to achieve, the union of all human knowledge, was too great to be contained in one place or one time. Fire could destroy buildings, but not the curiosity that built them. In the centuries that followed, travelers still came to Alexandria searching for traces of the great library. They found only ruins, buried under layers of newer cities. Fishermen spoke of strange stones under the sea, and scholars speculated that fragments of marble walls or shelves might still lie hidden beneath the harbour silt. The lighthouse still stood for a while longer, its flame guiding ships, long after the light of learning had moved elsewhere. Eventually it too would fall to earthquakes, leaving only the legend, the idea of a city that had once tried to hold the world in its hands. The myth of the caliph's fire, though false, served a purpose. It kept alive the memory of what had been lost. Each retelling reminded later generations that knowledge is fragile, that it must be protected not just from flame but from indifference. The story of the library's end, whether under Caesar's torches, the mobs of Theophilus, or the decree of Umar, became a mirror reflecting humanity's endless struggle between enlightenment and oblivion. Thus the final chapter of the ancient library was written not in smoke, but in silence. No one saw its last scroll crumble. No one recorded the final word copied by the last scribe. It simply faded, absorbed into new cultures, new faiths, and new languages. Yet in that fading lay its immortality. For as long as people remember the Library of Alexandria, it has never truly been lost. The library's disappearance left behind more than ruins. It left questions that have haunted scholars for 2,000 years. What exactly perished in those flames? Which voices were silenced forever when the papyrus curled and turned to ash? We cannot know for certain, yet glimpses remain. Fragments quoted by later writers, summaries preserved in commentaries, hints scattered through time like embers carried on the wind. They tell us that what burned in Alexandria was not just history but potential, discoveries that might have changed the world centuries before they were made anew. Among the scrolls once housed in the library were works on astronomy, mathematics, medicine, geography, and philosophy, the full spectrum of human curiosity. The astronomers of Alexandria had mapped the stars with astonishing precision. Aristarchus of Samos, whose writings were known to have been kept there, proposed that the Earth revolved around the Sun more than 1,800 years before Copernicus. Only fragments of his reasoning survive, preserved in later summaries, but they suggest a vision of the cosmos that could have altered the course of science had it endured. Hipparchus, another Alexandrian mind, catalogued the stars and measured their precession, an achievement so advanced that modern astronomers still use his data as a foundation. How much of his original work was lost to fire, and how much was later rediscovered, no one can say. In mathematics, the library's losses were equally profound. Euclid's Elements survived because it was widely copied, but many of his other writings did not. Archimedes, whose genius approached that of a modern physicist, composed treatises on mechanics and hydrostatics that were studied in Alexandria. Some were saved through later translations, others were gone, until a single palimpsest rediscovered in our time revealed traces of his forgotten brilliance. It is possible that the library contained even more: studies of infinitesimals, early conceptions of calculus, and theories of motion that could have advanced the understanding of physics by centuries. Medicine too flourished in Alexandria. The city's scholars practiced anatomy in ways that shocked their contemporaries. Herophilus and Erasistratus dissected the human body, identifying nerves, arteries, and the brain's role in thought. They recorded their findings in detailed treatises now lost. Only quotations in later works hint at their discoveries. Had their writings survived, the course of medical science might have changed dramatically. The knowledge painstakingly acquired in those marble halls would later have to be rediscovered by Renaissance anatomists more than 1,000 years later. The library was also home to philosophers who bridged the worlds of reason and spirit. Commentaries on Plato and Aristotle were written and stored there, along with dialogues exploring ethics, logic, and the nature of the divine. Some of these survived through copies made in other cities, but countless others vanished. Among them were works of early atomists and Stoics, whose theories of nature foreshadowed modern physics. The idea that matter was composed of invisible particles, that the universe followed laws rather than whims of gods, may have been explored in detail on scrolls now long turned to dust. The poets of Alexandria contributed another form of knowledge, that of imagination. Callimachus, Theocritus, and their followers reshaped Greek literature into something delicate and introspective. Their complete works once filled the library's shelves, alongside tragedies and epics now known only by title. Entire schools of poetry, local myths, and oral traditions from Egypt and beyond were written down and stored there. When the fires came, they consumed not only scientific insight, but also the emotional map of a civilization, the rhythm of languages, the myths of forgotten peoples, the songs of poets whose names have vanished. All were erased in moments. Yet perhaps the greatest loss was not in content, but in connection. The library had gathered the wisdom of many cultures: Greek, Egyptian, Babylonian, Persian, Indian, and placed them in dialogue. When it fell, that network collapsed. Knowledge became fragmented again, scattered across continents and centuries. Ideas that once spoke to each other grew isolated. The world entered what later historians would call the Dark Centuries, when progress slowed and rediscovery replaced discovery. To imagine what was lost is to imagine an alternate history. If Aristarchus's heliocentric theory had survived in full, the Renaissance might have dawned 1,000 years earlier. If Archimedes' understanding of mechanics had been preserved, the Industrial Age might have arrived in the time of Caesar. If Herophilus' anatomy had endured, the mysteries of the human body might have been unveiled long before the modern era. The destruction of the library was therefore not just a historical event, but a turning point in the story of human potential. It delayed enlightenment itself. Even so, not all knowledge vanished. Some scrolls had already been copied and distributed. Fragments found their way into Rome, into Byzantium, and later into the Islamic world. Through translation into Syriac and Arabic, a portion of Alexandria's wisdom endured, hidden within new languages and new philosophies. When Europe awoke centuries later, it was through these channels that the old learning returned. The library's body had burned, but its spirit had traveled the world, and yet we will never know its full reach. Archaeologists uncover fragments of papyrus in desert sands, sentences torn from unknown works, each a whisper from that lost archive. A single surviving line can change what we think we know. Every fragment is a reminder of what once was, a glimpse into a vast sea of knowledge whose surface we can barely see. The library's destruction was not just the loss of books, but the loss of a world where knowledge was treated as sacred, where collecting truth was a royal duty, and where curiosity itself was considered divine. In the silence that followed its disappearance, humanity learned a bitter lesson. Knowledge can die, words can vanish, and once gone, They must be born again through struggle. Yet the memory of the library kept that struggle alive. The dream of a place where all knowledge could be gathered did not perish with Alexandria. It transformed, reappearing in monasteries, in Baghdad's House of Wisdom, in the universities of medieval Europe, and later in the digital archives of our own age. The library's ashes became the soil from which new libraries grew. The ghost of Alexandria's library lingers most vividly in what we do not have. Every field of human thought bears traces of its absence, empty spaces where names should be, or references to works that no one has seen for 2,000 years. The ancient catalogue once kept by Callimachus listed hundreds of thousands of scrolls, arranged by subject and author. Only pieces of that list survive, quoted in later writings. Each missing entry represents a book erased not by time alone, but by the chain of disasters that followed the library through the ages. In mathematics, we glimpse the loss through whispers. Euclid's Elements was the beginning of geometry as we know it, yet ancient scholars mentioned other works by him, treatises on optics, on the division of figures, on data, of which only fragments remain. Archimedes was said to have written scrolls exploring principles of motion, energy, and levers that went far beyond the knowledge of his era. One legend claims he discovered a method approaching the calculus developed 2 millennia later, but his original proofs perished. The few that survived did so only because a scribe in Byzantium reused his parchment centuries later, and modern technology revealed the faint traces beneath. What might still lie lost, no one can say. In philosophy, the silence is even deeper. We know of schools and thinkers whose names reached us only because someone else mentioned them. The atomists of ancient Greece, Democritus and his followers, believed that all matter was composed of invisible particles moving through empty space. Epicurus expanded on their ideas, teaching that the universe followed natural laws rather than divine will. His works filled hundreds of scrolls, most of which disappeared. Only quotations in later texts survived, leaving us to reconstruct his system from fragments. Imagine how different history might have been if his ideas had remained widely read, if the world had never lost sight of the notion that nature obeys reason. Astronomy suffered similar erasures. Aristarchus's heliocentric model was revolutionary, yet almost all his writings were destroyed. Only a few lines preserved by Archimedes reveal his boldness. Later astronomers in Alexandria, such as Hipparchus, measured the heavens with precision, charting stars and predicting eclipses. His original catalogue of over 1,000 stars is gone, but traces of it were rediscovered when modern scientists compared ancient records to the sky itself. What we know of Hipparchus today comes from the echoes of his work found in the writings of others, faint imprints of a mind that once understood the cosmos with astonishing clarity. Medicine, too, was mutilated by loss. Herophilus, who worked in Alexandria during the city's early years, dissected human bodies to map the nervous system. He described the brain as the center of thought, centuries before others accepted it. Erasistratus discovered the difference between veins and arteries and studied the function of the heart. Their writings once filled entire sections of the library. Today, only short citations in later medical texts remain. The knowledge that could have guided healing for generations was wiped away. For more than 1,000 years, medicine in Europe would regress to superstition, and the body would again be treated as mystery until their insights were rediscovered through Renaissance anatomy. The poets and historians lost to the flames are harder to measure, but their absence is no less haunting. The library preserved not only the works of famous authors, but also those of obscure voices. Local chronicles, hymns, and plays never copied elsewhere. Some of these may have contained details of events we know only dimly today. The stories of vanished kingdoms, migrations, and early encounters between civilizations. Each lost narrative narrowed our understanding of the ancient world. The myth of the library's burning has become powerful, precisely because it is impossible to know what vanished. The imagination fills those silences with infinite possibilities. Even in fields like geography, the loss was profound. Eratosthenes' measurement of the Earth's circumference survived, but many of his maps and writings did not. He may have drawn the first world map based on mathematical coordinates, a document that could have guided explorers centuries earlier. The library also held accounts of travelers from Africa, Persia, and India, describing lands and peoples unknown to most of the Mediterranean. With their destruction, vast stretches of the ancient world faded from record. Knowledge of distant continents would have to be rebuilt from scratch in later centuries, as if the Earth itself had to be rediscovered. The ripple of that loss spread far beyond Alexandria. When later civilizations sought to recover the wisdom of antiquity, they found gaps they could not fill. Medieval scholars in Byzantium and the Islamic world reconstructed ancient science piece by piece, sometimes without realizing they were rebuilding what Alexandria had already known. The Renaissance thinkers who revived classical learning did so from fragments translated into Latin from Arabic, which had in turn been translated from Greek centuries earlier. Every translation carried errors, every copy dropped details, every age lost something it could never regain. And yet, the survival of even a few fragments is miraculous. The Elements of Euclid, the Almagest of Ptolemy, and the medical texts of Galen, all shaped by the intellectual world that Alexandria created, became bridges across the abyss of time. These surviving works carried in their margins references to others now gone, ghostly reminders of the library's vast unseen contents. They tell us that Alexandria's scholars were not dreamers alone, but engineers of understanding, building systems of thought that still hold the world together. Perhaps the greatest secret lost in those flames was not a single discovery or invention, but the method itself, the way Alexandrians approached knowledge. They believed that truth was not fixed, but pursued. That observation and reason, not tradition, were the path to understanding. They copied not only scrolls, but ideas, translating, comparing, and questioning. It was a culture that thrived on doubt, a community bound by the belief that to know the universe was to know oneself. When the library fell, humanity lost not only information but an entire way of thinking, the courage to question everything. The absence left by Alexandria's library is not only measured in missing titles, but in the slowed heartbeat of human progress that followed. The centuries after its fall reveal a world trying to remember what it had once known, reaching through shadow for the light it had lost. The philosophers of later ages wrote as if they were speaking to ghosts, aware that somewhere behind their fragmentary texts had existed entire systems of thought now dissolved into myth. Each surviving manuscript felt like a message from a drowned civilization. The loss of the library reshaped history in ways too subtle to count. Without the preserved works of mathematicians such as Archimedes and Apollonius, engineering in Rome never advanced beyond its practical foundations. The knowledge of complex mechanics, optics, and hydraulics that had once been explored in Alexandria was gone. Temples still rose, aqueducts still ran, but the theoretical vision behind them faded. When later inventors tried to rediscover the secrets of motion or balance, they did so by trial rather than by inheritance. The progress of science slowed from a river to a trickle. Philosophy too dimmed. The Alexandrian schools that had once blended reason and observation disappeared, and their methods of inquiry gave way to tradition and commentary. Where the scholars of the Mausion had questioned the cosmos itself, later thinkers debated words and interpretations. The freedom to doubt, the essence of discovery, was lost for centuries. The world turned inward, choosing certainty over curiosity. When faith became the language of power, knowledge learned to whisper. Historians believe that even chronology was fractured. The great annals of Egypt, Babylon, and Persia that might have survived in the library could have provided a continuous record of civilization from its dawn. Without them, later generations reconstructed history through myth. Whole centuries of the ancient world remain uncertain, blurred by the gaps left when those papyrus scrolls turned to ash. The Dark Ages were not only dark because of ignorance, but because the light that once illuminated time itself had been extinguished. And yet, even silence can echo. Across the Mediterranean, faint traces of Alexandrian thought appeared like stars seen through clouds. The philosophers of Byzantium quoted names that no longer existed in any book. The scholars of Baghdad translated Greek texts that bore the fingerprints of Alexandrian teachers. When the mathematician Al-Hazen wrote of light and vision, He was unknowingly rebuilding the theories once studied in the halls of the Mausion. When the physician Ibn Sina described the body as a system of harmony and flow, he was reimagining ideas born under the Egyptian sun 2,000 years earlier. The library had vanished, but its fragments had migrated into new tongues. By the time the Renaissance dawned in Europe, the spirit of Alexandria rose again in a different form. The rediscovery of classical knowledge, filtered through Arabic, Latin and Greek, reawakened the dream of a universal pursuit of truth. Copernicus revived Aristarchus's vision of the sun-centered cosmos. Vesalius revived the anatomy of Herophilus and Erasistratus. Galileo and Newton, though they never knew it, walked paths first traced in the sand by men whose names had long burned away. The library's ghost guided them. Even today, its shadow shapes how we think about knowledge. Modern science, with its vast databases and global archives, is an heir to that ancient ambition. Every research institution, every online repository, every attempt to collect and preserve information echoes the same impulse that built the Mausion. But the warning remains as well, for the library teaches that knowledge, once gathered, must also be protected. It can be lost not only to fire but to neglect, censorship, or decay. The lesson of Alexandria is that preservation is an unending act of vigilance. Some archaeologists believe remnants of the library still lie beneath the modern city, charred fragments buried under layers of stone and silt. If one were to walk along the ancient shoreline, beneath the noise of the markets and the rumble of traffic, one might stand above the ashes of scrolls that once held the dreams of the world. But the true remains of the library are not in the ground. They are in every attempt humanity has made to remember, to rebuild, to understand. The fire that burned its scrolls did not consume the desire that created them. The Library of Alexandria was never simply a building. It was a statement of faith. Faith in reason, in curiosity, and in the idea that truth belongs to everyone. When it fell, that faith was tested but not destroyed. Across centuries, in every culture that has valued learning, its spirit has reappeared. It lives wherever a question is asked, wherever a scholar copies a text, wherever someone looks at the stars and wonders. The library's loss is immeasurable, but its endurance is greater still. For centuries, storytellers have spoken of the Library of Alexandria vanishing overnight. 40,000 scrolls consumed by fire in a single tragic moment. It is an image too powerful to resist. The flames licking through marble halls, the ink melting from papyrus, the voices of the ancient world turn to smoke. Yet the closer historians look, the less certain that vision becomes. The evidence does not point to one cataclysm, but to many. The library did not die in a single night of fire. It faded slowly, undone by time, politics, neglect, and misunderstanding. The myth of instant destruction is a reflection not of history but of longing, a need to find one dramatic moment when knowledge itself seemed to perish. The legend begins with Caesar's siege in 48 before the Common Era, when flames from burning ships spread to the docks. Plutarch wrote that parts of the library were caught in the blaze, while Seneca quoted earlier sources claiming 40,000 scrolls were destroyed. Yet no contemporary account describes the main building burning. Strabo, who lived in Alexandria soon after, wrote of the Mausion as a living institution, not a ruin. Later historians, reading fragments of these accounts, wove them together into a single story of annihilation. But history is rarely that simple. Modern archaeologists and classicists argue that the library's loss was gradual. The first fire may have damaged only storage buildings near the harbour, destroying duplicates and copies rather than the core collection. The Mausion itself, protected within the royal quarter, likely survived. Evidence shows that scholarly life continued there well into the Roman era. Eratosthenes' successors maintained their catalogues. Teachers still lectured, mathematicians still produced new works. The library's decline was not a sudden collapse but a slow erosion. Over the centuries that followed, Alexandria suffered earthquakes, invasions, and shifts in empire. Each left its mark. The Romans who replaced the Ptolemies valued practical knowledge, medicine, engineering, navigation, but neglected the pure pursuit of wisdom that had once defined the library. Without royal patronage, the great institution lost its purpose. Scrolls decayed, catalogues went unmaintained, and the flow of new material slowed. By the time the Serapeum became the center of learning, the old library was already a ghost of itself. Yet stories of sudden destruction persisted because they are easier to tell. A single night of flames can be imagined. Centuries of quiet decay cannot. The myth of the overnight fire condensed generations of loss into one vivid image, turning gradual decline into tragedy fit for poetry. It mirrored humanity's fear of forgetting, the dread that everything we know could vanish in a moment. To blame one event, one conqueror, or one act of war was simpler than facing the truth that neglect can destroy as completely as fire. Historians studying the ruins of Alexandria have found no definitive evidence of one massive conflagration. Excavations near the supposed site of the library reveal layers of destruction from different periods, suggesting repeated rebuilding. Inscriptions refer to teachers and scribes working there even after Caesar's time. Coins and pottery from later centuries bear marks of the Mausion's continued use. The archaeological record supports the idea of continuity amid decline, not total annihilation. Even ancient writers disagreed. Plutarch, writing more than a century after the first fire, spoke vaguely of loss but offered no details. Cassius Dio described parts of the library as damaged, but did not claim complete ruin. Galen, the physician who studied in Alexandria in the 2nd century after the Common Era, mentioned the library's copyists and teachers as if they still existed. His writings imply that some form of the institution survived well into the Roman period. These clues paint a picture of endurance rather than obliteration. The final blows came not from a single conqueror, but from the long turning of history. When Emperor Theodosius banned pagan worship in the late 4th century, Christian mobs destroyed the Serapeum, which by then held what remained of the library's scrolls. Later earthquakes shattered much of the royal quarter, and floods from the sea erased what was left. By the time Arab forces entered Alexandria in the 7th century, the library's physical presence had already dissolved into memory. What they found was a city of faith, not philosophy. The legend that Caliph Umar burned the library was born centuries later, a fable crafted to give the world a clear villain in a story that otherwise had none. The myth of overnight destruction persists because it captures an emotional truth. The image of books burning in darkness, of a civilization's knowledge vanishing into flame, embodies our deepest fears about fragility. It reminds us how thin the thread of memory can be, yet real history tells a different story, one of resilience, adaptation, and survival through fragmentation. The library did not fall in a single night, but over centuries in ways more human and more tragic. It was undone not by enemies, but by time itself. The ruins of Alexandria whisper a more complicated truth than legend allows. Beneath the shifting sands and the foundations of later cities lie traces of walls, columns, and courtyards that belonged to the royal quarter. Archaeologists studying these remains have found no layer of ash that could mark one single catastrophic fire. Instead, they see cycles of damage and rebuilding, layers of history folded upon each other like pages written, erased, and rewritten again. The library's end, if we can call it that, was not a single act but a long unravelling, one that spanned generations and reflected the fragility of civilization itself. In the centuries after Caesar's siege, scholars continued to live and work in Alexandria. Galen, who studied there in the 2nd century after the Common Era, described professional scribes who copied manuscripts and catalogued scrolls for study. His testimony, casual yet invaluable, proves that the institution still functioned in some form hundreds of years after the supposed destruction. Later records mention lectures, debates, and correspondence between Alexandrian scholars and their peers in Rome and Athens. The library had changed, but it had not died. It had become a network of smaller archives scattered through the city, in private homes, temples, and academies, each carrying fragments of the greater whole. This survival through fragmentation mirrors the way knowledge itself endures. A book can burn, but ideas migrate. They hide in memory, in translations, in commentaries. The spirit of Alexandria lived on not through its walls, but through the scholars who refused to let its learning fade. Even as the royal library decayed, its offspring flourished elsewhere, in the Serapeum, in schools of rhetoric and philosophy, and in the minds of students who carried its teachings beyond Egypt's borders. The Museion, once a single body, had become a constellation. Modern historians have spent centuries untangling the myths surrounding its fate. The image of one apocalyptic fire persisted largely because it was retold by later writers seeking moral or political meaning. Christian chroniclers emphasized the role of pagan neglect. Pagan writers blamed Christian zeal, and later European historians blamed the Arab conquest. Each age projected its anxieties onto the library's ashes. In truth, none of these accounts fits the evidence. The destruction was not an act of evil, but of entropy, the quiet, relentless decay that claims all things left without care. The notion of a single night of ruin appeals because it offers closure. A great fire has drama, a clear villain, and a sense of finality. Slow decline, on the other hand, demands patience and humility. It shows that loss does not always come with thunder, but with silence. The unnoticed fading of ink, the crumble of papyrus, the forgetting of names. The library's demise teaches that destruction can be invisible. The absence of maintenance, the loss of funding, the disinterest of rulers. These forces can be more lethal than armies. When archaeologists uncovered the site of the Serapeum, they found evidence of reading rooms, scroll repositories, and sanctuaries once filled with scholars. The ruins bore marks of deliberate demolition from the late 4th century, confirming that the temple and its library met their end, not through neglect but through religious conflict. Yet even this destruction was partial. The scrolls may have been dispersed, their contents copied or hidden before the violence reached them. History rarely ends all at once. What perished in the Serapeum might have lived on in monasteries or in the libraries of Constantinople. The myth of instantaneous loss also hides an uncomfortable truth about responsibility. To imagine the library destroyed overnight absolves everyone who came after. It turns tragedy into destiny. But to accept that the decline lasted centuries means acknowledging that generations watched it happen and did nothing. The rulers who diverted funds, the officials who ignored repairs, the scholars who ceased to teach, all share in the quiet undoing. The library's death was not a crime of passion, but of indifference. Today, when historians reconstruct its story, they rely on clues scattered through time. The writings of travelers, fragments of papyrus found in tombs, inscriptions carved into fallen stone. Each new discovery reshapes the narrative. What once seemed certain dissolves into uncertainty again. This is fitting, for the library's story has always been a reflection of humanity's struggle to preserve knowledge against time's tide. Its legend grows, not because we know what happened, but because we do not. The mystery keeps it alive, and so, the overnight destruction becomes more metaphor than fact. It represents the moment when humanity realized how fragile its memory could be. In truth, the library's flame dimmed over centuries, flaring and fading with each generation. It was reborn many times before it was gone. To understand that truth is to understand our own responsibility. Knowledge dies not in fire but in forgetfulness, and the only defense against that darkness is care. The myth of the library's overnight destruction persisted because it told a story the human heart understood better than history ever could. A sudden fire is clean in its cruelty. It offers an image so vivid that no scholar, poet, or philosopher could resist it. We can see the glow against the harbour, the scrolls curling to ash, the frantic scholars weeping in the light of their own ruin. It is a tragedy that fits in a single heartbeat. But truth rarely burns so brightly. Truth fades, truth rots in silence. Truth slips away because no one bothers to copy it again. The library's decline teaches this harder truth, that the greatest losses come not from flame, but from apathy. What destroyed the library was not merely the soldiers of Caesar, or the zealots of Theophilus, or the armies of Umar, but centuries of forgetfulness. The rulers who found no use for philosophy, The scholars who preferred reputation to preservation, the generations who assumed someone else would remember, they too fed the invisible fire. The story of Alexandria is the story of what happens when humanity stops believing that knowledge is sacred. And yet, even as the myth of the single night spread, it carried within it something vital. It kept memory alive. For every historian who questioned the tale, there were 1,000 poets and painters who reimagined it, each keeping the flame from dying completely. In their retellings, the library became a symbol of all lost wisdom, Atlantis of the mind, Eden of the intellect. Writers from Lucan to Gibbon, from Voltaire to Carl Sagan, evoked its fall as a moment when humanity betrayed itself. The details changed, but the warning remained. Knowledge can vanish if not cherished. In this way, the myth did what reality could not. It made the library immortal. The image of fire preserved what the scrolls themselves could not. Every time someone spoke of that night, whether in sorrow or awe, they participated in a ritual of remembrance. The library that burned in legend became greater than the library that once stood. Its ashes fertilized imagination. The real building may have fallen stone by stone, but the story rose higher with each century, like smoke refusing to fade. Modern scholars have come to see this paradox clearly. The myth of instantaneous destruction survives because it embodies a truth about fragility. It dramatizes what every historian knows, that knowledge is mortal. The Library of Alexandria, in this sense, never truly perished. Its myth became its second life, one written not on papyrus but in the human mind. The idea of it, the dream of a place where all wisdom could live together, became more enduring than any wall or scroll could ever be. When we say the library vanished overnight, what we really mean is that humanity woke one morning and realized how much it had forgotten. The myth compresses centuries of decay into a single gasp of recognition. The fire is our collective memory trying to make sense of its own failures. We need the drama because slow loss is unbearable to watch. But the slow loss is what truly happened. The quiet unraveling of a masterpiece, thread by thread, until only legend remained. This understanding changes how we see Alexandria's legacy. It was not a victim of one empire or one faith, but of time itself, the same force that will test every archive, every database, every cloud of our own era. The myth warns that preservation is never finished. There will always be another fire, another flood, another generation too distracted to copy the texts that matter. The library's death, stretched across centuries, is a mirror held up to all of civilization. And yet, the myth's endurance is proof of survival. As long as the story is told, the library still breathes. Every scholar who writes of it, every artist who imagines its halls, every student who dreams of the knowledge once stored there, keeps it alive. The idea that knowledge can be gathered and shared, that light can be drawn from darkness, is the library's truest legacy. So, perhaps the library did vanish overnight, but not in the way the legend claims. It vanished from the world of stone and papyrus, only to be reborn in the realm of memory and meaning. The flames that supposedly destroyed it were instead the flames that made it eternal. When the last echoes of Alexandria's library faded into silence, something subtle but vast changed in the rhythm of human thought. Knowledge did not vanish entirely, but its path fractured. For centuries, the world had possessed a single center, a place where languages, traditions, and discoveries converged under one roof. The destruction of that center scattered the pieces of understanding like shards of glass across continents. What had once been a steady light of inquiry became many flickering flames, isolated from each other, each struggling to survive in the darkness that followed. The first to feel the loss were the scholars themselves. When the library's scrolls disappeared, so too did the connective tissue of knowledge. The philosophers of later centuries often wrote as though they were rebuilding a world from memory. They cited authors whose works no longer existed, debated ideas without access to the original sources, and repeated calculations once known in detail but now guessed at from fragments. The science of the stars, the geometry of the earth, the understanding of medicine, all became broken languages. Humanity had to learn to speak reason again. In the centuries that followed, the heart of learning migrated north and east. Byzantium, heir to the Eastern Roman Empire, became the new refuge of classical knowledge. Its libraries, though never as vast as Alexandria's, preserved what they could. Manuscripts copied and recopied by monks who did not always understand their content, but sensed their importance. They became caretakers of memory, guarding the embers of a vanished age. Meanwhile, in Persia and later in the cities of the Islamic Golden Age, a new spark was kindled. Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba inherited what Alexandria had lost, translating Greek and Egyptian works into Arabic, refining and expanding upon them. In those cities, the spirit of the Mausyan was reborn. But the road to that rebirth was long. Between the fall of the Serapeum and the rise of Baghdad's House of Wisdom, stretched centuries often described as dark, not because light was absent, but because it was scattered. Europe drifted into a period of superstition and stasis. Without the continuity that Alexandria had once ensured, generations grew up cut off from the knowledge their ancestors had possessed. Medicine reverted to magic, astronomy to prophecy, philosophy to dogma. The tools for understanding nature still existed, but they lay buried under fear and faith. The absence of the library changed not only what people knew, but how they thought. The Alexandrian scholars had embraced questioning as a sacred act, believing that doubt was the beginning of wisdom. With their disappearance, that tradition weakened. In its place grew reverence for authority, first imperial, then religious. The shift from inquiry to obedience reshaped civilization. Ideas that might have flourished were instead confined, awaiting rediscovery centuries later. Imagine the difference if Alexandria had endured. The continuity of knowledge might have carried Aristarchus's vision of a sun-centered cosmos into the Roman age, perhaps inspiring further observation instead of being forgotten until Copernicus. The works of Herophilus and Erasistratus might have advanced medicine far beyond the limits of medieval superstition. The mechanical theories of Archimedes might have ignited an age of engineering long before the Renaissance. Instead, progress paused. Humanity walked in circles through familiar shadows, rediscovering truths that had once been written clearly on papyrus now turned to dust. Yet loss has its strange gifts. The destruction of Alexandria forced civilization to reinvent its relationship with knowledge. When learning was concentrated in one place, it could be destroyed with one blow. Scattered, it became resilient. The decentralization of wisdom, first through Byzantium, then through the Islamic world, then through Europe, ensured that no single fire could erase it again. In this sense, Alexandria's death became the seed of future survival. The very fragility that doomed it taught the world how to endure. By the time scholars in Baghdad began collecting and translating Greek texts, they were consciously reviving the Alexandrian dream. The House of Wisdom was not built in imitation of the library, but in continuation of its spirit. There, philosophers like Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, and Ibn Sina reinterpreted Aristotle and Plato through the lens of Islamic thought, blending faith and reason, much as the Alexandrians had once blended Greek and Egyptian ideas. They developed algebra, optics, and medicine, not as isolated disciplines but as parts of a universal search for truth. The library had vanished, but its vision of unity had survived. Meanwhile, in the monasteries of Europe, monks copied whatever manuscripts they could find, often without realizing their value. They preserved Aristotle's logic and Ptolemy's astronomy, laying the groundwork for the intellectual revival that would one day bloom into the Renaissance. When those texts returned to Europe from Arabic and Greek sources centuries later, they brought with them not only information but the echo of a lost ideal, the belief that all knowledge, no matter its origin, belonged to the same human story. The scars of Alexandria's loss can still be traced in the gaps of history. We can see them in the missing centuries of astronomy, in the rediscovery of surgical techniques already known 2,000 years earlier, in the philosophical puzzles that had to be solved again from the beginning. The library's destruction delayed progress but did not destroy it. It turned a straight path into a labyrinth, forcing humanity to find its way by feeling rather than by map. That long detour, painful though it was, may have deepened our understanding of what knowledge truly means. For knowledge is not merely accumulation, it is continuity. It is not only the gathering of facts, but the preservation of context, the web of connections that give meaning to discovery. The library's fall severed many of those threads, teaching us how fragile understanding can be. It left a scar that still aches whenever a book burns, a database fails, or a scientist's notes are lost. Each such loss is a faint echo of that ancient catastrophe, a reminder that civilization depends not only on learning, but on remembering. The fall of Alexandria's library reshaped the geography of human thought. When the last scholars left its colonnades and the last scrolls turned to dust, the torch of learning began a long and uncertain journey across the world. What had once been concentrated in a single city now drifted like embers on the wind, carried by travelers, translators, and dreamers who refused to let memory die. Knowledge, once royal, became nomadic. In Byzantium, the scholars of the Eastern Empire became the first custodians of what could be saved. Constantinople, the city of Constantine, rose as the new sanctuary for the written word. Its libraries housed copies of Greek and Roman texts, rescued from the decline of the West. Scribes worked through the night by the light of oil lamps, recopying the fragile manuscripts that had survived wars and weather. In those quiet rooms, the spirit of Alexandria found shelter. The Byzantines were not innovators in the Alexandrian sense. They were preservers. They saw themselves as guardians of a heritage they did not fully understand, but which they believed must never be lost. Their careful transcriptions would later become the bridge through which the wisdom of antiquity crossed into the modern world. Further east, the legacy of the library took on new life under the rising star of Islam. The early caliphs, inheriting the lands of Egypt, Persia, and Mesopotamia, recognized the power of knowledge as both divine and practical. They founded centers of study that echoed the Musion in purpose, if not in name. In Baghdad, the House of Wisdom became the beating heart of this intellectual renaissance. Scholars from many faiths, Muslim, Christian, Jewish, and Zoroastrian, gathered to translate Greek and Persian works into Arabic. They studied mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, weaving old insights into new systems. It was here that the Fragments of Alexandria were reborn. The texts of Aristotle, Euclid, Ptolemy, and Galen were translated, commented upon, and improved. Al-Khwarizmi developed algebra from Greek and Indian roots. Ibn al-Haytham studied light and vision, echoing the optical theories once taught in the Hellenistic laboratories. The astronomer al-Battani refined planetary calculations that would one day influence Copernicus. Each of these figures was, knowingly or not, continuing the work of the library. They built upon foundations that the fire had not entirely consumed. This revival was not mere preservation. The scholars of Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba transformed what they inherited. They saw no boundary between faith and reason, viewing the study of the cosmos as an act of devotion. The library's dream of unity, that all knowledge from all cultures belonged to one human quest, lived again in their academies. When they wrote, they did so in Arabic, but their words carried the rhythm of Greek logic and the precision of Egyptian science. In this way, Alexandria's flame burned with new color, lighting paths that would lead centuries later to the scientific revolution. Meanwhile, in the far reaches of Europe, the light flickered faintly. The Western Roman Empire had fallen, and its intellectual life collapsed into chaos. Yet even there, remnants of the old learning endured. Monks in stone monasteries copied what few texts they could find. Fragments of Aristotle, the poetry of Virgil, the medical treatises of Galen. Often, they did not understand the theories they transcribed, yet their devotion preserved them for future generations. Each manuscript was a time capsule, a fragile vessel carrying knowledge across centuries of darkness. As the Islamic world flourished, Europe slowly began to awaken. Contact through trade and conflict in Sicily, Spain, and the Crusader states reintroduced Western scholars to the knowledge they had lost. Translations from Arabic back into Latin carried the wisdom of Alexandria full circle. The works of Aristotle re-entered Europe not from Greece but from Baghdad. The geometry of Euclid, the astronomy of Ptolemy, the medicine of Ibn Sina, all reached the universities of Paris and Bologna through these channels. The circle of learning, broken by fire, had quietly closed. Yet even in this global exchange, the absence of the library could still be felt. Much of what was rediscovered was incomplete, fragmented, or distorted by centuries of copying. Commentaries replaced originals, summaries replaced sources. The intellectual genealogy of civilization became a puzzle missing many pieces. The world had regained knowledge, but not memory. It understood the results of discovery, but not always the journey that led there. This scattering of learning changed how humanity thought about knowledge itself. The dream of a single universal library gave way to the idea of a network, a web of centers, each contributing to the whole. No city could again hold the world's wisdom alone. From this decentralization grew resilience, but also humility. The world learned that understanding must be shared to survive. The fall of Alexandria taught that knowledge is strongest not when it is hoarded, but when it travels. By the 15th century, the invention of the printing press transformed this lesson into reality. Books could now be multiplied faster than any fire could destroy them. In this sense, the spirit of Alexandria triumphed at last. What had once been a dream confined to papyrus became a principle of civilization, that knowledge should flow freely and belong to all. The scars left by the library's fall became the foundation for this new beginning. Yet the memory of the lost never faded. Even as Europe entered its age of rediscovery, artists and scholars still mourned Alexandria. To them, the library was both wound and warning, proof of how fragile brilliance can be. Its absence defined the boundaries of what was possible. Every rediscovery felt like an echo of something that had once been known and lost. The scars of the library were not just historical, they were psychological. They shaped how humanity imagined progress, as a process of rediscovery rather than invention. The story of knowledge since Alexandria is, in many ways, the story of that scar healing. Every academy, every university, every archive that rose after it was built on the dream of preventing such a loss from happening again. But the scar remains visible, a reminder that even the brightest light can fade if left unguarded, and that the pursuit of wisdom is a fragile, endless act of faith. The scar left by the library's fall runs deeper than the ruins of Alexandria. It is written into the history of thought itself, in every lost century, in every rediscovery mistaken for invention, in every unanswered question that might once have been resolved. Humanity did not simply lose scrolls, it lost continuity. The thread that connected generations of thinkers snapped, and with it, the sense that progress was a single conversation stretching across time. After the library, knowledge became fragmented, reborn in isolation again and again, each age forced to rebuild what another had already known. In philosophy, that break reshaped how people understood truth. The ancient world had cultivated a confidence that reason alone could explain the universe. The thinkers of the Mausion and the Lyceum believed that every phenomenon, from the movement of the stars to the beating of the heart, could be described through logic and observation. When their writings disappeared, so too did that confidence. In their place grew mysticism, dogma, and the notion that divine revelation must guide inquiry. The balance between faith and reason, once so carefully maintained in Alexandria's halls, tilted toward faith alone. It would take more than 1,000 years for the pendulum to swing back. In science, the loss was measurable. The astronomical models of Hipparchus and Aristarchus were forgotten, replaced by simpler ideas that placed the Earth at the center of creation. The heliocentric vision of the cosmos had existed once in the library's scrolls, precise and elegant, but its destruction forced later generations to begin from ignorance. When Copernicus finally revived that model in the 16th century, he did so as if inventing it anew, unaware that he was echoing voices silenced 1,500 years before. The same story unfolded in medicine, where the anatomical discoveries of Herophilus and Erasistratus vanished, leaving Europe trapped in primitive theories until the Renaissance reopened the body to reason. The absence of those scrolls also meant the absence of critique. Without the texts themselves, the world could not question them. For centuries, the authority of a few surviving writers, such as Aristotle and Ptolemy, went unchallenged. Their works became sacred because there was nothing left to compare them to. The diversity of thought that had once flourished in the library was replaced by uniformity. In losing its contradictions, humanity lost its ability to argue freely. The progress of ideas depends not on agreement, but on debate, a debate the library had once hosted on a global scale. When that stage burned away, the conversation fell silent. And yet, out of silence, new voices emerged. The very absence of knowledge created the hunger to seek it again. Every age that looked back at the ruins of Alexandria felt that ache, the longing to recover what had been lost. That longing became one of civilization's most powerful engines. It drove the scholars of Baghdad to translate the Greeks, the monks of Europe to copy ancient texts, the explorers of the Renaissance to chart the stars anew. The memory of the library, whether true or mythical, became a promise that humanity could rebuild, that light could return after darkness. This longing also gave birth to the idea of universal knowledge as moral duty. The Library of Alexandria had been a project of kings. Its successors were built by the people. Universities, academies, and public libraries grew from the conviction that wisdom should never again belong to a few. The library's fall taught the world that knowledge must be shared to survive. Every printing press, every archive, every digital database of today is a descendant of that lesson. The fire that once consumed papyrus ignited the principle that information must be multiplied and distributed, lest it vanish again. Yet even as knowledge became more secure, the shadow of Alexandria remained. The story of its destruction became a warning repeated through ages of war and censorship. When the Mongols burned Baghdad in the 13th century, chroniclers compared it to the fall of the Great Library. When monasteries were looted in Europe, scholars invoked Alexandria's ashes. When modern wars destroyed universities and museums, the same words returned: another Alexandria lost. The library became more than history. It became a symbol of what civilization risks every time it forgets that learning is sacred. The intellectual consequences of its fall still shape our imagination. We speak of rediscovery as triumph, but beneath it lies tragedy, the quiet admission that we are finding again what we once knew. We measure our progress in cycles, not lines, because Alexandria taught us that knowledge can regress. Every breakthrough carries the ghost of what was lost, a reminder that enlightenment is never permanent. It must be rebuilt in every generation. And perhaps this is the library's final paradox, that in its destruction, it ensured its immortality. The fire that consumed its scrolls became a story that will never die. It burned an idea into the human spirit, that knowledge is fragile, that truth is precious, and that forgetting is the most dangerous form of destruction. The scar it left is not a wound to be healed, but a mark of memory, a reminder that light, though it may fade, always returns. What was once thought to be lost forever did not vanish completely. The fire that devoured the scrolls of Alexandria could not burn the minds of those who had read them. The knowledge born within its marble halls scattered across the world like sparks carried by wind. In that scattering began a second life for the library, no longer a single building, but a living network of memory, hidden in monasteries, copied in dim rooms, whispered from teacher to student across centuries. The dream that the Ptolemies had kindled refused to die. When the Serapeum fell, some scholars fled with what they could carry: bundles of papyrus, wax tablets, codices bound in leather. Others had long before sent copies of prized works to friends in other lands, ensuring survival by diffusion. These fragments found refuge in unexpected places. In the libraries of Constantinople, the great city that rose from the ashes of empire, scribes carefully transcribed Greek and Latin texts onto parchment, replacing the brittle papyrus of Egypt with more durable pages. The Byzantines became guardians of ancient thought, preserving it even as their world shifted between faith and politics. To the east, The rise of the Islamic Golden Age revived the spirit of Alexandria more vividly than anywhere else. In Baghdad's House of Wisdom, scholars gathered to translate Greek and Persian works into Arabic. Under caliphs who saw learning as devotion, knowledge became a sacred inheritance. Mathematicians, physicians, and astronomers labored over the same subjects that once filled the library's shelves. Euclid's geometry was rendered into Arabic and given new life. The works of Galen shaped Islamic medicine, and the writings of Aristotle were studied with such intensity that they became part of theology itself. The dream of a universal collection of wisdom had crossed languages and continents. There was no single fire that could destroy this new network. When texts were copied by hand in multiple lands, destruction in one city no longer meant oblivion. The loss of Baghdad to Mongol flames centuries later could not erase what had already spread to Cordoba, Damascus, Cairo, and beyond. The Library of Alexandria had perished because it was one. Its rebirth succeeded because it became many. In Europe, the long sleep of the Middle Ages was not without its quiet awakenings. Monks in Ireland, France, and Italy preserved fragments of ancient texts without fully understanding their significance. They wrote by candlelight, copying the words of Aristotle, Plato, and Ptolemy onto thick parchment, sometimes decorating the margins with gold leaf, as if instinctively honoring what they could not explain. The chain of transmission continued through them. The monks did not know they were saving civilization, they were simply doing the patient work of faith. Then, in the 12th century, contact between the Islamic world and Europe began to reopen the old channels of learning. In Spain and Sicily, translators worked feverishly to render Arabic texts back into Latin. The works of Euclid, Galen, and Aristotle returned to Europe like travelers home from exile. Alongside them came new contributions from the Islamic scholars who had preserved and expanded their knowledge. Algebra, astronomy, and medicine re-entered Western thought, carrying with them the fingerprints of every civilization that had touched them since Alexandria's fall. The dream of the library had become a global enterprise. When the Renaissance dawned, the fragments of the library's wisdom fused once more into a coherent light. The rediscovery of Greek manuscripts, some preserved in Byzantine vaults, others found in desert monasteries, reignited curiosity. The printing press, invented in the 15th century, turned that light into a fire that no ruler could control. Books multiplied by the thousands. The knowledge that had once existed in a few precious scrolls became accessible to anyone who could read. The spirit of Alexandria had finally escaped the fragility of papyrus and the tyranny of walls. In this new age, scholars recognized their debt to the ancients. Copernicus, who placed the sun at the center of the cosmos, studied translations of Greek works. Vesalius, who dissected the human body to draw its anatomy, walked in the footsteps of Herophilus and Erasistratus. Kepler, Galileo, and Newton carried forward questions first asked under the Mediterranean sun 2,000 years before. Each rediscovery was a resurrection. Each book printed was a fragment of the library reborn. Even so, the story of Alexandria never ceased to haunt them. The idea that knowledge could vanish in fire became a symbol of both fragility and resolve. Architects, philosophers, and poets invoked its memory whenever they built universities or wrote about enlightenment. They understood that the library's true legacy was not its scrolls, but its spirit, the conviction that wisdom must be gathered, protected, and shared beyond borders or faiths. Today, its lineage extends into the digital age. Every database, every global archive, every network of scientists and thinkers working together across continents is a descendant of the Mouseion. The difference now is that knowledge no longer lives in one place. It flows like the Nile through endless channels of connection. Yet, even in this abundance, the warning remains. The more knowledge we gather, the greater our duty to preserve it. The more powerful our technology, the more fragile our memory becomes. The Library of Alexandria did not survive in stone, but it endures in principle. It lives in the belief that all human understanding is connected, that wisdom is not the property of one culture, but the birthright of all. The copies and fragments that traveled the world carried more than information. They carried an idea that learning itself is sacred. That idea has outlived empires, outlasted religions, and survived every fire. The dream of the Library still stands, invisible but eternal, built not from marble, but from memory. Its shelves are the pages of every book, its halls the rooms of every mind that seeks to know. It was never truly lost, only transformed. For centuries, the Library of Alexandria lived only in legend, its walls imagined in poetry and its fate debated in whispers. Yet beneath the modern city, buried under layers of stone and time, fragments of its physical reality still sleep. Archaeologists have long searched for them, guided by the hope that somewhere beneath the shifting streets lies a trace of the world's greatest archive. Each discovery, however small, pulls a ghost into light. It is a search not only for ruins, but for proof that the dream of universal knowledge was once real. The city of Alexandria today stands upon its own ruins. The ancient shoreline lies far inland, buried by centuries of sediment and construction. Earthquakes and floods have reshaped its contours, swallowing palaces, temples, and libraries beneath the Mediterranean. The royal quarter, once home to the Mausoleum and the library, now lies beneath the modern harbour. Divers exploring these waters have found colossal statues toppled into the sand, fragments of sphinxes and columns that once lined marble courtyards. Among them, they hope, may rest the foundations of the library itself. The search began in earnest in the 19th century, when European explorers, armed with curiosity and shovels, began probing the city's layers. They found remnants of the Serapeum, the daughter library that survived after the original fell silent. Deep beneath modern streets, stone chambers were uncovered, some bearing inscriptions and niches that might once have held scrolls. The archaeologist Mahmoud Bey el-Falaki, one of the earliest to map ancient Alexandria, proposed that the great library had stood near the palace complex by the harbour, close to the location of what is now the modern university. His maps, drawn in the 1870s, became the foundation for all later excavations. In the decades that followed, archaeologists uncovered more clues. At Qom el-Dika, the ruins of lecture halls and auditoriums emerged, semicircular stone tiers that could seat hundreds of students. These structures, dating to the Roman era, bore the unmistakable signature of a scholarly institution. Here, perhaps, philosophers once debated astronomy and mathematics. Here, the echoes of the Mausoleum might still linger. Though no scrolls have ever been found, the architecture itself speaks of study and learning. The Serapeum offers another piece of the puzzle. Dedicated to the god Serapis, it was both temple and library, housing what many believe were the remnants of the original collection. When Christian zealots destroyed it in the year 391 after the Common Era, the last known sanctuary of Alexandria's knowledge was lost. Excavations on its site have revealed underground galleries and storage rooms, the kind of secure, cool spaces ideal for scroll preservation. Shattered statues of Serapis and carved reliefs depicting scholars suggest that this was indeed a centre of learning. The destruction was so thorough that little survived beyond these foundations, but even these bare stones whisper of what once stood above them. Modern technology has added new precision to the search. Ground-penetrating radar and satellite imaging now allow archaeologists to peer beneath the dense urban fabric without disturbing it. These tools have revealed hidden structures beneath the modern city grid, including corridors and walls that align with ancient maps of the royal quarter. Some believe these could belong to the administrative heart of the Ptolemies, perhaps even the Mausoleum itself. Yet excavation remains nearly impossible. Alexandria is alive, a city of millions built atop its own shadow. To uncover the library would mean dismantling part of the living city, a price no one is willing to pay. Underwater archaeology has offered a different path. Off the coast of the modern harbour lies a submerged landscape, the ruins of ancient docks, palaces, and breakwaters. There, divers have discovered statues of pharaohs, columns of red granite, and fragments of inscriptions naming Ptolemaic rulers. Among them, archaeologists found a large stone platform that may have been part of the royal compound where the library once stood. Each dive adds new detail to the map of lost Alexandria, but the library itself remains elusive. Perhaps it was never one grand structure, but many smaller buildings linked by colonnades, its scrolls spread among them like seeds in a garden. In the 1990s, Egypt and the international community built a new library on the shore, the Bibliotheca Alexandrina. Its circular design, tilted toward the sun, evokes both the rising of knowledge and the memory of what was lost. Beneath its gleaming stone lies a museum displaying fragments from the ancient city, recovered from both land and sea. The new library stands not on the same ground as the old, but within sight of it, a symbolic resurrection rather than a literal one. Its purpose mirrors the ancient vision, to gather the world's knowledge in one place and make it accessible to all. The archaeologists who continue to dig in Alexandria know they may never find the library's remains intact. Time has erased its name from stone, its scrolls from history, and its architecture from the earth. Yet in their search they preserve something more important, the human refusal to forget. Each shard of marble, each buried stair, each inscription reclaimed from the seabed is a reminder that the library was real, that it was not merely a legend but a place where the world once came together to understand itself. The silence of the ruins is not empty, it hums with the weight of what once was. Somewhere under the city, beneath the markets and houses, the foundations of that dream still rest. The stones that once carried 40,000 scrolls and the ambitions of a civilization that believed knowledge could outlast kings. The library may never be found in full, but its presence is felt in every discovery that points to its existence. The archaeologist's search is, in truth, a continuation of the library's mission. They too collect fragments piece by piece to reconstruct a picture of the world. Their brushes and scanners are new instruments in the same symphony of curiosity that began more than 2,000 years ago. The great library's body may have been lost, but its soul endures through those who still seek it. The shoreline of Alexandria continues to shift, the sea reclaiming and revealing in equal measure. Perhaps one day a storm will uncover a buried chamber, a carved lintel, or even a tablet bearing the names of the scrolls once stored there. Until then, the legend lives beneath the waves and within the hearts of those who dig. The library's final secret is not what lies beneath the earth, but what remains above it, the unbroken desire to know. The Library of Alexandria has become more than a ruin, more than an event, more than a place. It is an idea that transcends time, a symbol of what humanity can achieve when it values knowledge, and of what it can lose when it does not. Though its marble walls have vanished, its image has lived in every age, reborn in words, paintings, and dreams. It has become a mirror reflecting our highest hopes and our deepest fears. The fire that once devoured papyrus now burns within imagination itself, a reminder that every civilization carries both the power to create and the power to destroy. From the earliest chroniclers to modern poets, the legend of the library has been retold not as history but as myth. Ancient writers spoke of it with awe, shaping its memory into a warning. Medieval scholars, separated from its ashes by 1,000 years, imagined it as a golden age of wisdom now irretrievably lost. During the Renaissance, when Europe rediscovered the classical world, artists painted vast halls lined with scrolls and philosophers, a paradise of intellect brought to ruin by human folly. In these depictions, the library became a kind of sacred tragedy, a temple whose destruction marked the fall of reason itself. Its story reappears whenever books burn. When the Mongols sacked Baghdad in the 13th century, witnesses said that the Tigris River ran black with the ink of manuscripts thrown into its waters. They compared the destruction to the burning of the Alexandrian library. When conquistadors in the 16th century burned the codices of the Maya, chroniclers again invoked Alexandria, seeing in those flames the repetition of an ancient curse. The pattern continued across centuries, the monasteries destroyed in the Reformation, the libraries bombed in wars, the archives lost to censorship or neglect. Each time people said, "Another Alexandria has fallen." The library had become shorthand for the death of knowledge itself. Writers and philosophers have drawn from that symbol to express the fragility of civilization. Voltaire used the library's burning as a metaphor for intolerance. Jorge Luis Borges, the blind librarian of literature, imagined an infinite library of Babel, where all books exist but none can be understood, a paradoxical tribute to the dream of Alexandria. Carl Sagan spoke of it with reverence, describing it as the first great experiment in the collective mind of humanity. For him, the library's destruction was not only a tragedy of the past, but a warning for the future. To lose knowledge once is misfortune, to lose it again would be a choice. Artists, too, have found inspiration in the library's legend. Painters depict scholars fleeing with scrolls against a backdrop of flame. Filmmakers portray it as a labyrinth of light, its fall accompanied by music that mourns more than it describes. Architects have borrowed its geometry, vast circular forms that suggest both openness and mystery, to design modern museums and universities. Even digital archives have invoked its name, seeking to continue what the Ptolemies began. The library, once destroyed by fire, now exists in countless virtual forms across the planet. Its myth has become architecture, art, and code. The power of the legend lies not in what it tells us about the past, but in what it reveals about ourselves. Every age reinvents the library according to its fears and desires. To the Romans, it was the hubris of empire. To medieval monks, it was pagan decadence. To Enlightenment thinkers, it was the martyrdom of reason. In the modern world, it stands as a metaphor for information itself, beautiful, boundless, and fragile. Its destruction reminds us that progress is not inevitable, that knowledge must be defended as fiercely as territory or treasure. And yet, the myth carries hope. The story of the library's fall has never been told without an undercurrent of resurrection. Each retelling implies a challenge. Rebuild it in your own way before it is too late. The new Bibliotheca Alexandrina embodies that impulse. Its curved walls of glass and stone rise like the disk of the sun above the Mediterranean, reflecting light into the sea. Inside, millions of books rest in climate-controlled silence, guarded by the hum of modern technology. Scholars from every continent walk its halls, surrounded by inscriptions in hundreds of languages, a declaration that knowledge belongs to all humankind. The ancient dream breathes again, not as nostalgia, but as continuity. Still, the library's image remains bittersweet. It is both triumph and loss, both beacon and warning. It reminds us that even in an age of abundance, knowledge can vanish not only through destruction, but through neglect, disinterest, or distortion. The myths that surround it teach that memory must be tended like flame. If left unattended, even the brightest fire burns out. The legend of the library has also become a story of redemption. Humanity, haunted by what it once destroyed, has built countless libraries in atonement. Every archive, every digital repository, every university campus is a quiet act of remembrance. The myth's endurance proves that we have learned something from the ashes, that the pursuit of knowledge is sacred precisely because it can be lost. In truth, the Library of Alexandria has never ceased to exist. It lives wherever a human mind reaches beyond ignorance. It lives in the pages of a book opened at midnight, in the curiosity of a child staring at the stars, in the scientist mapping galaxies, in the artist painting light. Its myth endures because it has become part of the collective memory of our species, the story of who we are when we seek understanding, and of what we become when we forget. So when we speak of the library that burned, we are not mourning stone and papyrus. We are mourning potential, all the knowledge that might have changed the course of centuries. But we are also celebrating endurance, the stubborn persistence of thought. The library fell, yet the dream it embodied rose higher than fire could reach. It became a myth precisely because it was true in spirit, if not in stone. The myth of Alexandria endures because it is unfinished. It waits for each generation to add its own chapter, a reminder that the story of knowledge has no final page, only a constant turning of leaves. The library may have been lost, but its echo fills the world. Every time we open a book, connect across distance, or ask a question that challenges the unknown, we rebuild it anew. Imagine for a moment that it happened again. Not in marble halls filled with papyrus, but in the invisible networks that now hold the memory of our age. One night, without warning, a single solar storm or digital collapse erases 40,000 archives, databases, research papers, art, music, languages, and histories stored across the world. The cloud turns dark. The servers go silent. The knowledge of a generation vanishes, not in smoke, but in silence. We would stand again at the edge of an absence, facing the same question that haunted the ashes of Alexandria. How much of ourselves can we afford to lose? The thought is not far-fetched. We live in an age more dependent on information than any before it, and yet our memory is more fragile than ever. The scrolls of Alexandria burned in fire. Our libraries now exist as electrons, vulnerable to time, error, and neglect. The devices that hold our wisdom can fail in a heartbeat. Hard drives corrode, code becomes obsolete, servers age, and the internet, that vast echo of the Mouseion, is not eternal. If tomorrow's storm, war, or oversight erased the world's data, we would face a loss beyond comprehension, a modern library of Alexandria dissolving into nothing. The Ptolemies dreamed of gathering every book, every story, every map and calculation ever written. They built a temple to knowledge, believing that understanding the world was the same as mastering it. We have achieved their dream in ways they could never imagine. Billions of volumes live in digital archives. Satellites carry the sum of our science. Languages once doomed to vanish are recorded and preserved in sound. Yet the dream has grown so large that we no longer see its fragility. We believe our knowledge to be permanent simply because it is vast. The lesson of Alexandria warns otherwise. When the great library burned, what perished was not only information, but the connections between minds, the continuity of thought that allows ideas to evolve. The same danger faces us now. A digital loss would not merely delete data, it would sever the invisible threads that link discoveries together. The formulas, the medical histories, the astronomical observations, all could vanish, leaving future generations to rediscover what we once knew. The fire that destroyed 40,000 scrolls could now burn across the entire world, invisible but total. And yet, in imagining this, we see the true legacy of the library. It taught us that knowledge must be shared, duplicated, and scattered to survive. That no archive should exist in isolation, no civilization should trust its memory to one vault. The library's fall gave birth to this truth. Preservation is participation. To safeguard knowledge is to keep it alive by spreading it. Every backup, every translation, every act of teaching is a continuation of that ancient mission. The new Library of Alexandria, reborn on the shore of the Mediterranean, stands as a symbol of that renewal. Its glass walls tilted toward the rising sun, a promise that memory can endure if humanity chooses to protect it. If 40,000 scrolls vanished tomorrow, humanity would grieve, but it would not end. The loss would wound us, yes, but within that wound would awaken the same instinct that saved fragments of the old library, the will to rebuild. We would begin again, copying, restoring, piecing together from what remained. We would remember that knowledge is not contained in servers or scrolls, but in the minds that create and preserve it. The Library of Alexandria's true destruction was never its fire, it was the forgetting that followed. To lose knowledge once is tragedy, to let it fade willingly is surrender. In this age of abundance, we stand on the same threshold the Ptolemies once faced, the edge between wisdom and arrogance. They believed their collection complete, we believe ours invulnerable. Both are illusions. The library's ruins remind us that understanding is a living process, not a monument. To preserve it, we must continually renew it, teach it, question it, and share it beyond borders. The greatest archive is not one that holds everything, but one that inspires everyone to remember. The dream that began in Alexandria still guides us. It exists wherever people seek truth, in observatories peering into galaxies, in laboratories decoding the origins of life, in the classrooms where children discover that the universe can be understood. The library's loss gave meaning to its survival, For from its ashes rose the belief that knowledge, though mortal, can always be reborn. 40,000 scrolls did not disappear in a moment. They faded across centuries of fire, neglect, and ambition. Yet their absence continues to echo. The library that vanished overnight is not merely a relic of loss. It is a reminder. Knowledge must be protected, renewed, and passed on, or else tomorrow's scrolls may vanish too. And if they did, we would know what to do. We would gather again by the light of the sun and begin to write.